before the sun could touch the mountains surrounding Tenochtitlan, before the first birds called across the lake, before light crept through doorways of stone and thatch, the city was already awake. Not with voices, not with movement, but with a sound that modern ears would struggle to place the whisper of obsidian against stone, blades being sharpened in the darkness. This was the sound of morning in the Aztec world. Not the chime of alarms or the grind of coffee beans, but the careful preparation of instruments designed for a single purpose: drawing blood from your own body before the day could properly begin. In homes throughout the city, from the emperor's palace to the simplest farmer's dwelling, the ritual was the same. Adults rose in darkness, children only slightly after. They didn't stretch or yawn or ease into wakefulness the way you might. They prepared, and what they prepared for wasn't breakfast or work or any ordinary task. They prepared to wound themselves. The tools varied by social class. Wealthy families used stingray spines, traded from distant coasts at considerable expense. Others relied on maguey thorns, sharp enough to pierce skin but common enough that anyone could obtain them. The poorest used obsidian fragments, volcanic glass, sharper than any metal blade their world possessed. But regardless of the tool, the purpose remained identical across every level of Aztec society. They would pierce their earlobes first, most commonly. A practiced motion, quick and precise. Blood would well up, collected carefully on strips of special paper. Some mornings required more. Tongues were pierced, the pain immediate and silencing. Thighs were punctured, inner arms, sometimes places we won't name, but which you can imagine would make you flinch just thinking about them. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't penance for sins or mistakes. This was Tuesday. This was every morning. This was as automatic and necessary as any habit you perform without thinking: brushing teeth, checking your phone, making coffee. Except instead of caffeine, the Aztecs needed blood. Specifically, they needed their own blood, offered to forces they believed controlled whether the sun would rise at all. Children learned young. By age 5, most Aztec children could perform the basic ritual on themselves. Parents didn't shield them from this practice the way modern parents might protect children from sharp objects or frightening ideas. They taught them carefully, demonstrating the correct angle, the proper depth, the prayers to recite, while pain blossomed fresh and immediate. The blood, once collected on paper, would be burned. The smoke carried it upward, toward gods the Aztecs believed were always watching, always hungry, always requiring proof that humanity remembered its debt. Missing this ritual wasn't like skipping breakfast and feeling hungry later. It was cosmic negligence. It was inviting catastrophe not just for yourself, but for everyone. Pain was currency in this world. Blood was the language spoken between mortals and the divine. And the sun itself that guaranteed constant in your sky, that thing you never worry won't appear tomorrow, the Aztecs worried. They worried every single night that dawn might not come if they failed in their obligations. So millions of people, across an empire that would make Rome envious in its sophistication, started every day by deliberately wounding themselves. They did it calmly, they did it routinely. They did it believing that their personal suffering, multiplied across the population, purchased another sunrise for everyone. And they taught this to children before those children could fully understand what they were doing or why. But why? What cosmic fear, what foundational terror could drive an entire civilization to wound themselves before breakfast? What story about the universe makes pain before dawn feel not just reasonable, but absolutely necessary? The answer begins with a debt the Aztecs believed could never be fully repaid. The Aztecs told a story about the beginning of the world. Not our beginning, theirs. The fifth sun, they called it. Fifth, because 4 worlds had come before, each created and destroyed by gods, experimenting with existence, trying to get creation right. 4 failures, 4 apocalypses. And then the current world, the one you and they inhabited, though separated by centuries. This 5th sun came at a price the gods themselves paid. In the sacred city of Teotihuacan, in darkness absolute, the gods gathered to create a new sun. But creating a sun required more than divine will or cosmic engineering. It required sacrifice. Someone had to throw themselves into a fire so enormous, so consuming, that they would be transformed into the sun itself. 2 gods volunteered, one wealthy and proud, one humble and diseased. The proud god hesitated at the flames, the humble god leaped, and in that leap the sun was born. But it didn't move. It hung frozen in the sky, new and blazing but motionless, because creating a sun and making it move across the heavens were different problems requiring different solutions. So the other gods sacrificed themselves, all of them. They gave their blood, their energy, their divine essence to set the sun in motion. And it moved, it rose, it set. It established the cycle that makes life possible. But here's what the Aztecs understood that made every morning an existential crisis. The sun's movement wasn't perpetual. It wasn't self-sustaining. The divine sacrifice that started it needed constant renewal. The gods had given everything to create the mechanism, but humanity inherited the responsibility of maintaining it. Every sunrise, from the Aztec perspective, was conditional. The sun didn't rise because physics dictated it must. It rose because humanity provided the energy required. And that energy could only come from the most precious substance humans possessed, blood, which contained life force the gods recognized as payment for the debt humanity could never finish repaying. Imagine waking every morning with that knowledge. Not abstract religious belief you could doubt privately, but foundational certainty taught from childhood and reinforced by every authority you trusted. Your blood, spilled at dawn, might be the specific contribution that kept the sun moving today. Miss your obligation, and you weren't just neglecting personal duty. You were gambling with everyone's survival. This created something modern psychology might recognize as collective existential anxiety. But to the Aztecs, it wasn't anxiety, it was responsibility. Priests calculated exactly how much blood different social classes owed based on complex formulas involving birth dates, social position, and cosmic mathematics we'd need archaeoastronomers to fully explain. Nobles bled more because they possessed more vital energy. Commoners bled less, but still bled. Everyone participated because everyone benefited from sunrise. The prayers recited during morning bloodletting reveal the psychology underneath. Translations survive, preserved in codices. The Spanish conquest didn't destroy. They're not prayers of hope or faith. They're prayers of anxiety, reminders to the gods that humans remember their obligations, apologies in advance for blood that might not be enough. Desperate linguistic contracts trying to ensure that today's offering satisfies cosmic requirements. Children learned these prayers as songs. Before they understood what death meant or could grasp the concept of apocalypse, they were singing about humanity's eternal debt and the catastrophe that would follow if that debt went unpaid. Existential dread wasn't something that developed in adolescence or adulthood. It was installed in childhood, embedded so deeply that questioning it would feel like questioning whether breathing was necessary. The sun didn't rise because it had to. It rose because the Aztecs bled. And if they stopped bleeding, everything stopped. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't philosophy. This was the operating system of reality as they understood it. But bloodletting before breakfast was just the opening act. Once the sun cleared the horizon, purchased by collective sacrifice, the real complexity of Aztec life began. With the sun secured, at least for today, Aztec families turned to breakfast. And here's where things get even stranger, because even the most ordinary meal existed in the shadow of practices that modern minds struggle to process. A typical morning meal might include amaranth porridge, warm and filling, tamales wrapped in corn husks, steamed until tender, perhaps chocolate for those who could afford it, a drink reserved for warriors and nobles, bitter and energizing. By any measure, sophisticated cuisine. The Aztecs had developed agriculture that supported a city larger than most European capitals. They understood nutrition, flavor combinations, preservation techniques. But amaranth wasn't just grain. During certain ceremonies, it was mixed with human blood to create sawali ceremonial cakes, shaped like gods and consumed as sacrament. The chocolate drink, rich and complex, was sometimes mixed with substances that would alter consciousness, or with blood that would sanctify the drinking. Food and ritual, nourishment and religion existed in the same space without clear boundaries between them. And then there's the practice we've been circling, the one that makes everything else seem almost reasonable by comparison. The Aztecs practiced cannibalism. not survival cannibalism born from desperation, not random violence, ritualized, religiously justified consumption of human flesh. Here's how it worked. Enemy warriors captured in battle would be treated as honored guests for months, fed the finest foods available, given decent housing, treated with respect. Not because the Aztecs were kind to prisoners, but because they understood those prisoners as future vessels for transferring divine energy. When a warrior was finally sacrificed, portions of his body would be distributed to the warrior who had captured him and his family. They would cook this flesh using traditional methods, sometimes boiled with maize and seasonings, sometimes roasted, prepared with the same care they'd give any important meal. And they would eat it, believing genuinely that consuming the flesh of a brave warrior transferred his courage, his strength, his vital essence to those who consumed him. Commoners rarely participated directly. This was largely a warrior class practice, a privilege of those who fought and captured enemies. But everyone knew it happened. The temple complexes where sacrifices occurred weren't hidden in remote locations. They dominated the city center. And when human flesh was being prepared, the smell would drift through neighborhoods, across canals, into homes where children played and families gathered. That smell was just part of the city's atmosphere during certain festivals. Like any urban smell, you become accustomed to exhaust fumes, restaurant kitchens, industrial processes. Except this was the smell of human bodies being cooked, and everyone from childhood onward understood what it meant and where it came from. Children grew up with this knowledge integrated into their understanding of how the world worked. Bodies weren't just individuals, they were containers for divine energy that could be recycled through consumption. Death didn't end a warrior's contribution. Consumption transformed it into strength for others. The Aztecs didn't see this as horror. They saw it as the highest honor. Being consumed meant your essence lived on in those who ate you. Refusing to participate, finding it disgusting or wrong, would have seemed bizarre, like refusing to eat food because you found nourishment itself offensive. Modern Aztec cuisine is celebrated globally. Chocolate, avocados, tomatoes, vanilla, chili peppers, contributions that changed food worldwide. The agricultural and culinary sophistication was genuine and impressive. But every meal, every recipe, every cooking technique existed in a culture where human flesh was occasionally on the menu, prepared with the same care and skill as anything else. Breakfast finished, the sun climbing higher, and now the day's real work began, starting with educating children in ways that would make modern parents question everything they thought they knew about childhood. Aztec children went to school, universal education, centuries before most civilizations considered it. Mandatory attendance regardless of social class. On paper, this sounds progressive, almost modern. But what happened inside those schools would make any contemporary parent recoil in absolute horror. There were two types of schools, divided by birth. The Telpochcali for commoners, the Karmakak for nobles. Both taught reading, mathematics, history, religion. Both prepared students for adulthood in a civilization that valued knowledge and discipline. But the methods, the underlying philosophy, the daily reality of Aztec education had nothing to do with nurturing curiosity or fostering individual potential. Aztec schools existed to break children down and rebuild them as warriors or priests. Everything else was secondary. A typical day at the Telpochcali began before dawn. Children as young as 7 would wake in darkness, their bodies already aching from the previous day's training. They would run, miles through the city and surrounding hills, at altitude that makes breathing difficult even for adults accustomed to it. The thin air burned their lungs, their legs cramped, they ran anyway. After running came weapons training. Wooden swords and shields, lighter than real combat equipment, but still heavy enough to exhaust small arms. They would practice strikes, blocks, formations for hours. Their hands would blister, then bleed, then callous. Mistakes brought immediate punishment. An instructor might pierce a child's earlobe with a maguey thorn as correction for improper stance, or force them to inhale smoke from burning chili peppers, a torture that left children gasping, tears streaming, throat and lungs burning for hours. There was no concept of play as we understand it. No recess where children could be children. Everything was preparation. War training, religious instruction, memorization of hundreds of lines of poetry about sacrifice and cosmic duty. The only games permitted were ones that taught combat skills or religious principles. Children slept on cold stone floors deliberately, not because the schools couldn't afford bedding, but because comfort was viewed as weakness. They fasted regularly, going days with minimal food to teach their bodies to function on nothing. They performed bloodletting in front of classmates, normalizing the practice through public repetition until it became as ordinary as writing on a chalkboard. The Karmakak, schools for noble children, were worse. These children were being prepared for leadership, which meant they required even more intensive breaking and rebuilding. Sleep deprivation was standard. Students would be kept awake for days, their consciousness fragmenting, hallucinations beginning, until they could barely distinguish reality from vision. Then priests would interpret their exhaustion-induced experiences as divine communication. Sensory deprivation in pitch-black rooms for extended periods taught noble children to master fear. Physical punishment was constant and creative. The goal wasn't sadism for its own sake. The goal was creating leaders who could endure anything, who had been so thoroughly conditioned to pain that nothing an enemy might do could break them. Graduation from these schools didn't involve ceremonies with caps and gowns. It involved actual combat. Teenage boys would accompany warriors into real battles. Their task was simple and absolutely terrifying. Capture an enemy warrior alive, not injure one, not participate in a group capture. Individually subdue a trained adult warrior and bring him back as prisoner for sacrifice. Many teenagers died during these graduation attempts. This wasn't considered a flaw in the system. It was the system working as designed. Those who died weren't weak exactly, just not strong enough. Those who survived had proven themselves worthy of adulthood. And the truly disturbing part? Aztec parents participated in this system lovingly. They didn't send their children to these schools resentfully, viewing education as necessary evil. They believed genuinely that this brutal conditioning was the greatest gift they could give their children. The world was dangerous. Enemies surrounded the empire. The gods demanded strength. Weak children became dead adults. Better to break them young and build them properly than send them into the world unprepared. Childhood mortality was high, but not from neglect, from deliberately imposed hardships intended to strengthen survivors. The children who made it through Aztec education were harder, tougher, more capable of enduring suffering than almost any population in history. They were also being taught something else, something that went beyond combat training or religious instruction. They were learning their place in a hierarchy so rigid, so absolutely enforced, that a wrong glance could mean execution. In Tenochtitlan, where you looked could kill you. Not metaphorically, literally. The simple act of raising your eyes at the wrong moment, allowing your gaze to fall on the wrong person, could end with your execution. Aztec society operated under a social stratification so extreme that every interaction between classes followed precise protocols. Commoners who encountered nobles on the street were required to avert their eyes immediately. Looking directly at a noble's face wasn't just disrespectful. It was spiritual contamination. Nobles carried divine essence in their blood, their bodies, their very presence. A commoner's direct gaze was believed to pollute that divine essence, risking cosmic imbalance. So commoners learned to navigate their own city without seeing it. They walked with eyes downcast, necks bent, entire postures communicating permanent submission. This wasn't occasional formal behavior reserved for important ceremonies. This was every day, every interaction, every moment outside their homes. The emperor existed in a category beyond even normal nobility. People who approached him had to wear rough clothing, fine garments, would be presumptuous. They had to enter his presence walking backwards to avoid seeing his face directly. Some sources suggest that speaking directly to the emperor, without being addressed first, could result in immediate execution, though accounts vary on how strictly this was enforced. The punishments for violating hierarchy protocols were designed to be memorable. Cotton clothing was reserved for nobles. A commoner wearing cotton could be flayed alive, their skin removed in strips while they remained conscious. Families have been executed, because a child accidentally touched a noble's cloak while playing. Entire villages were razed because they failed to show proper deference to visiting officials. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty by sadistic leaders. It was religious framework made physical law. The Aztecs genuinely believed that nobles carried divine essence that required protection from common contamination. Social hierarchy wasn't just human organization. It was cosmic structure made visible through daily interactions. Here's where it gets psychologically complex. Aztec society was simultaneously rigid and meritocratic, depending on context. In warfare, any common warrior who captured enemies could rise through military ranks, gaining status and privileges. Battlefield achievement could elevate families. But in civilian life, birth determined nearly everything. A farmer's son would almost certainly die a farmer, eyes permanently downcast, neck perpetually bent. Daily life reinforced this hierarchy through countless small humiliations. Commoners and nobles ate separately, walked on different sides of streets, used different grammatical forms when speaking to superiors. Children learned these protocols from infancy. A toddler who looked directly at a noble might receive immediate physical punishment from their own parents, teaching through pain that some rules tolerated absolutely no flexibility. The language itself encoded hierarchy. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, had different vocabulary and grammatical structures for addressing superiors versus inferiors. You couldn't speak to a noble using the same words you'd use with equals. The language forced speakers to constantly acknowledge and reinforce social stratification. Even death maintained hierarchy. When nobles were sacrificed, they received elaborate ceremonies. Priests would prepare them for days. Their deaths would be witnessed by crowds, marked with specific rituals acknowledging their status. When commoners were sacrificed, the ceremonies were often truncated, mass-produced, dozens killed in quick succession, with minimal ritual attention. Yet paradoxically, being chosen for sacrifice was considered an honor regardless of class. Death in service to the gods elevated even commoners to a kind of status they could never achieve in life. This created a strange psychological dynamic where the highest privilege available was being selected to die for cosmic purposes. Rebellions against this system were remarkably rare, not because the Aztec military brutally suppressed dissent, though they certainly could have, but because most Aztecs couldn't psychologically conceive of alternative arrangements. The hierarchy wasn't oppression from their perspective, it was natural order. Questioning it would be like questioning gravity or the necessity of breathing. Children internalized their place through constant reinforcement. A commoner child never experienced being treated as equal to a noble child, never saw their parents stand upright in a noble's presence, never heard language that suggested hierarchy was negotiable or constructed rather than fundamental. This rigid structure governed every waking moment, every interaction, every decision about where to walk and how to speak and where to direct your eyes. It created a population where millions of people lived their entire lives in postures of submission, never experiencing what we'd consider basic dignity or social equality. But when Aztecs closed their eyes and slept, hierarchy dissolved. In dreams, commoners and nobles alike traveled to other realms where earthly status meant nothing. Though what they found there brought different terrors entirely. The Aztecs feared sleep, not in the way you might fear nightmares or insomnia, but for reasons far stranger and more disturbing. They believed that when you closed your eyes and drifted away from consciousness, your soul, the Teolia, left your body and traveled to other realms. Sleep wasn't rest, it was a journey. And like any journey into unknown territory, it carried serious dangers. Dreams, from the Aztec perspective, weren't random neurological static or your brain processing the day's events. Dreams were real experiences happening to your traveling soul. The images, the encounters, the strange logic of dream space, all of it was actual occurrence, requiring careful interpretation and often immediate ritual response. Priests maintained extensive dream codices, essentially encyclopedias of dream meanings developed over centuries. These weren't vague suggestions like modern dream interpretation books. They were specific, detailed, and often terrifying in their precision. Dreaming of teeth falling out meant imminent family death. Not maybe, not possibly death was coming. Dreaming of water which sounds peaceful enough, indicated illness approaching. Dreaming of jaguars meant someone was using witchcraft against you. The jaguar in your dream was the transformed soul of an enemy performing spiritual attack while you were vulnerable in sleep. Bad dreams required immediate ritual response at dawn. Bloodletting to cleanse spiritual contamination. Offerings to specific gods determined by what you dreamed. Sometimes confession of hidden sins, because priests taught that bad dreams were punishment for transgressions. You'd tried to hide from human authorities, but couldn't hide from cosmic forces. Nightmares weren't just disturbing experiences, they were evidence of spiritual warfare. Dream priests would prescribe protective amulets, specific sleeping positions, prayers to recite before bed, all designed to protect the traveling soul from the entities that lurked in the realms between waking and sleeping. Some people deliberately sought prophetic dreams through a practice called dream incubation. They would fast for days, perform extensive bloodletting, then sleep in specific temple rooms, believed to facilitate divine communication. The dreams that came after such preparation were considered especially significant, messages from gods that required immediate interpretation by the highest-ranking priests. This created a culture of sleep anxiety that's difficult for modern people to fully grasp. Aztecs feared going to bed because they didn't know what their traveling souls might encounter or what information dreams might reveal. Dreams could predict disaster. They could expose secret sins. They could demonstrate divine displeasure that required immediate correction. Parents obsessively monitored their children's dreams. A child's dream content could indicate future warrior potential, priestly calling, or darker possibilities. Dream patterns established early determined how children were educated and what social roles they'd be guided toward. And here's the darker political dimension. Dreams could be weaponized. Priests sometimes declared that someone's reported dreams revealed heresy or treason. If your dreams suggested doubt about religious teaching or dissatisfaction with current leadership, those dreams could get you killed. The line between genuine belief in dream interpretation and political manipulation was deliberately kept blurry. Sleep paralysis, that terrifying experience where you're conscious but unable to move, had a specific explanation in Aztec cosmology. Those were attacks by Tzitzimitl, skeletal star demons, that descended at night to devour the living. The paralysis was their weight on your chest. The sense of presence in the room was their actual presence. Specific prayers and body positions were prescribed to prevent these attacks, though their effectiveness was never guaranteed. Insomnia carried its own suspicions. People who couldn't sleep regularly might be practitioners of dark magic, whose souls were too busy cursing neighbors to rest properly. Chronic insomnia could get you investigated by priests, questioned about what you were really doing while others slept. The fear of dream space permeated daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. People adjusted their behavior, controlled their thoughts, managed their anxieties, all in hopes of securing peaceful sleep and harmless dreams. Yet sleep remained unpredictable. You could follow every protocol, make every offering, live righteously, and still dream something that brought priests to your door, asking uncomfortable questions. And here's what makes this especially haunting. These beliefs didn't entirely disappear. Modern descendants of Aztecs in rural Mexico still practice versions of dream interpretation that echo these ancient traditions. Curanderos, traditional healers, still interpret dreams, still prescribe rituals for bad dream sequences, still maintain that sleep connects us to other realms where different rules apply. The Aztec understanding of consciousness, of the permeability between waking and sleeping states, persists in fragments. Changed, adapted, mixed with other traditions, but recognizably descended from ancestors who feared their own dreams. But dreams were only one method of traveling to other realms. The Aztecs had discovered far more direct approaches involving plants, fungi, and rituals that would alter consciousness so profoundly that modern psychiatry would classify them as extreme psychological trauma. The Aztecs possessed a doorway to other dimensions, not metaphorically, not in some vague spiritual sense. They had discovered actual substances that dissolved the boundary between this world and others, between self and cosmos, between life and whatever exists beyond it. They called them Tionanacatl, flesh of the gods, small brown mushrooms that grew in specific locations at specific times, harvested with ceremonies, and treated as sacred objects more valuable than gold or jade. These weren't recreational drugs in any sense we'd understand. They were mandatory religious sacraments for certain roles, consumed in carefully controlled rituals that could determine whether you lived or died. The ceremony began with preparation, days of fasting, bloodletting to purify the body, sexual abstinence, confession of sins to priests. Then, in darkness absolute, in temple rooms designed specifically for these journeys, the mushrooms were consumed. Usually, in significant quantities, far beyond what anyone seeking pleasant experience would take. What happened next, according to Aztec accounts and Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these ceremonies, was complete ego dissolution. The sense of individual self would fragment and disappear. The person would die, psychologically speaking, while their body remained alive and breathing. They would encounter gods face to face, receive instructions about future actions, sometimes see visions of their own deaths, playing out in precise detail. This wasn't optional spiritual exploration for curious mystics. For young men seeking warrior status, mushroom ceremonies were requirements. Priests would administer the mushrooms and then evaluate the visions that resulted. The right visions, demonstrating courage, divine favor, willingness to sacrifice, meant acceptance into warrior ranks. Wrong visions, showing cowardice or heresy, could mean rejection from military service or worse. Imagine your entire future depending on what you experienced during a hallucinogenic journey you couldn't control. Your career, your social status, possibly your life, all determined by what gods you saw and what messages they gave you, while your consciousness was fragmenting under the influence of fungal compounds. Spanish conquistadors who witnessed mushroom ceremonies wrote accounts dripping with horror. They described people convulsing, screaming, claiming to see divine beings, sometimes harming themselves under the influence because the gods demanded it. One chronicler described it as demonic possession, the work of Satan corrupting indigenous souls. But from the Aztec perspective, these ceremonies were sophisticated spiritual technology. They understood set and settings centuries before modern psychedelic research codified those concepts. Specific chants guided experiences. The darkness and controlled environment shaped journeys. Priests with experience could steer visions through suggestion and interpretation. This also meant mushroom journeys could be manipulated. A priest could frame your visions to support political agendas, interpreting divine messages in ways that conveniently aligned with what authorities wanted. The gods spoke through your experience, but priests translated those messages, and translation is always an act of power. Different mushroom varieties served different purposes, some for divination, revealing hidden knowledge or future events, some for healing, though the healing worked through psychological transformation rather than physical medicine, some specifically for communicating with the dead, allowing temporary contact with ancestors who could offer guidance or warnings. Regular ego-death experiences had profound psychological effects. If you died psychologically dozens of times during mushroom ceremonies, actual physical death became less terrifying. The boundary between alive and dead blurred. Personal sacrifice stopped seeming tragic when you'd already experienced self-dissolution repeatedly and returned intact. The Spanish, predictably, violently suppressed these practices. Mushroom ceremonies were classified as devil worship. Indigenous people found conducting them were punished severely. The knowledge was driven underground, hidden in remote communities, practiced secretly where authorities couldn't observe. But they didn't eliminate it. Travel to certain regions of Mexico today, find the right communities, speak to the right people, and you'll discover that mushroom ceremonies never completely stopped. They changed, adapted, mixed with other traditions, but they continue. The original religious context has fragmented, the elaborate Aztec theological framework is largely gone, but the core practice using these mushrooms to journey to other realms persists in recognizable forms. The Aztecs had found something real in those mushrooms, something that transcended their specific culture and survived conquest, colonization, and centuries of suppression. But mushrooms were only one key in an extensive pharmacopoeia of consciousness-altering substances. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec emperor maintained botanical gardens that would make modern research facilities jealous. These weren't decorative gardens for leisure walking. They were living laboratories where specialists cultivated and studied plants from across the empire, experimenting with combinations, dosages, and applications that rivaled anything European medicine had achieved. The Aztecs didn't divide plants into neat categories of medicinal versus magical. That distinction wouldn't have made sense in their worldview. They had discovered that the right plant, prepared correctly, could heal infected wounds, induce prophetic visions, or kill an emperor so subtly that death appeared natural. Medicine, magic, and poison existed in the same botanical spectrum. Ololiuki, morning glory seeds, contained compounds similar to LSD. Ground into powder and consumed ritually, they produced visions used for divination. Priests would take them before making important decisions, interpreting the altered consciousness that followed as divine communication about which choice pleased the gods. Toloach, known elsewhere as datura or Jimson weed, caused powerful delirium. In controlled doses, Aztec physicians used it medicinally. In larger amounts, it became tool for darker purposes. Nahuali shamans and sorcerers supposedly used it in rituals meant to transform themselves into animals or send sickness to enemies. The line between medical treatment and spiritual attack blurred when the same plant could do both depending on intention and preparation. Peyote came from northern tribes through extensive trade networks. The Aztecs recognized its power, but treated it with caution. Knowledge of its effects passed through commercial relationships with peoples who'd been using it for generations. Tobacco was sacred, consumed only by elites during ceremonies. Not casual smoking, but deliberate ingestion of massive quantities that produced altered states through nicotine overload. The Aztecs understood tobacco's power to affect consciousness and restricted access accordingly. But the real sophistication showed in combinations. Aztec physicians could treat infections using plant compounds that modern analysis reveals contained genuine antibacterial properties. They could set broken bones with precision, using specific plant preparations to manage pain during the procedure. They could perform surgery with obsidian blades sharper than modern scalpels, preventing infection through botanical treatments we're only now beginning to understand chemically. This same knowledge was weaponized. Political rivals disappeared after consuming drinks laced with plant extracts that caused death, mimicking heart failure or stroke. Judicial executions sometimes used botanical poisons that worked slowly, publicly, demonstrating state power through the victim's prolonged suffering. The paranoia this created among elites was profound. Food tasters became essential for anyone with enemies. Elaborate precautions surrounded meals. Some nobles maintained personal gardens, where only trusted family members handled their food plants, fearing contamination or substitution. Nahuali occupied a strange professional category. Officially, authorities condemned them as practitioners of dark magic. Unofficially, powerful people consulted them for treatments mainstream priests couldn't provide. Some Nahuali claimed they could transform into animals through plant preparations, and certain botanical combinations genuinely could induce out-of-body experiences and dissociative states, where believing you'd transformed wouldn't be unreasonable. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they were simultaneously horrified and fascinated. The sorcery they witnessed seemed demonic, but the medical knowledge was undeniably sophisticated. Spanish physicians consulted with captured Aztec doctors. Botanical samples were shipped back to Europe for analysis. Some of this knowledge was integrated into European medicine, though stripped of its religious context and reframed as purely medical rather than spiritual. Much was deliberately destroyed. The Spanish viewed Aztec botanical knowledge as dangerous, potentially heretical. Codices containing plant preparations were burned. Specialists who possessed this knowledge were eliminated or forced to abandon their practices. Centuries of accumulated understanding were systematically erased. But not completely. Fragments survived in remote communities. Knowledge passed secretly from generation to generation. Modern ethnobotanists working with indigenous communities in Mexico are still discovering plant preparations that echo Aztec practices, still deciphering how specific plants were used and why those combinations produce particular effects. And here's what should disturb modern sensibilities. Many common medicines have chemical structures remarkably similar to compounds the Aztecs extracted from plants. Aspirin derivatives, contraceptives, Anesthetics. The Aztecs got there first, centuries ago, without laboratories or chemical analysis. They experimented directly on human bodies, refined their understanding through trial and error, and achieved results we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. The Aztecs understood something fundamental. Transformation wasn't just spiritual. It was chemical, physical, and sometimes permanent. Which brings us to the most visible transformations of all the ways they permanently modified their own bodies from the moment of birth. Aztec parents held down their newborn babies and deliberately deformed their skulls. This wasn't abuse. It wasn't neglect. It was love. Refusing to modify your child's body meant condemning them to a life of shame, invisibility, and social death worse than physical death. Within days of birth, before the soft bones of an infant's skull hardened permanently, parents would bind the baby's head between wooden boards. Over weeks and months, as the child grew, pressure would reshape the skull, elongating the forehead into a shape considered beautiful and symbolizing divine connection. This wasn't optional. It was standard practice across all social classes, though nobles often pursued more dramatic modifications. The pain this caused infants, if they were old enough to feel and remember it, went undocumented. The practice was so normalized that questioning it would seem bizarre, like questioning whether babies should be taught to walk or speak. But skull modification was only the beginning. Parents pierced infants' ears and lips, tiny holes that would be gradually expanded over years. By adulthood, some nobles wore lip plugs so large they couldn't speak clearly without removing them. This speech impediment wasn't disability, it was status display. The ability to choose communication difficulty as decoration demonstrated wealth and position. Teeth received similar treatment. Warriors filed their teeth to sharp points, transforming smiles into weapons, appearance matching function. Nobles embedded jade and obsidian into their teeth, gemstones permanently affixed into living bone. The procedures were painful, the healing difficult, and infections common. Dental abscesses from these modifications caused chronic pain, sometimes death. But refusing modification meant social exclusion more painful than any infection. Scarification marked bodies with personal history. Each scar told a story: warrior achievements, religious initiations, social transitions. Bodies without scars suggested cowardice or failed religious devotion. Parents ensured their children accumulated the right scars at the right ages, marking development through permanent tissue damage. Some practices were extreme, even by Aztec standards. Certain priests deliberately deformed their ears through constant bloodletting and wearing increasingly heavy ornaments. Over years, earlobes would stretch until they hung nearly to shoulders. Elongated flesh serving as permanent advertisement of religious dedication. Warriors received tattoos, though not the decorative kind we imagine. These were sacred images of gods embedded into skin through a process involving sharp spines and dyes made from insects and plants. The procedure took hours, sometimes days, for elaborate designs. The pain was intended as much as the imagery. Suffering during tattoo application proved devotion and endurance. Physical beauty in Aztec culture meant demonstrating capacity to endure transformation and pain. Smooth, unmodified skin looked childish, undeveloped. An adult body should show evidence of willingly accepted suffering and permanent choices made about identity and status. Your body was your resume, displaying qualifications and achievements in ways that couldn't be faked or temporarily assumed. The Spanish conquistadors found Aztec appearance disturbing. Chronicles described them as demonic, self-mutilated, disfigured. The modified skulls, filed teeth, stretched ears, and scarred skin violated European aesthetic standards so completely that some Spanish struggled to see Aztecs as fully human. But here's the inversion that makes this truly uncomfortable. Aztecs looked at Spanish bodies with similar horror. The conquistadors' round skulls looked malformed, like birth defects never corrected. Their intact teeth seemed childish. Their unmarked skin suggested lives without achievement or courage. To Aztec eyes, the Spanish appeared barbaric and underdeveloped, bodies that had never been properly transformed into adult form. These modifications served purposes beyond aesthetics. They created visible, permanent social hierarchy. A commoner couldn't fake noble skull modification or dental work. Your body displayed your status in ways impossible to hide or lie about. It was biological authentication of social position, religious identity, and personal history all at once. The practices were so normalized that Aztecs couldn't imagine adult bodies without modification. The idea of leaving a body in its natural state would seem as strange as refusing to teach children language. But body modifications, permanent as they were, only addressed the living. The Aztec relationship with bodies extended far beyond life into death, where bodies became something else entirely. In 1519, Spanish conquistadors entered Tenochtitlan and saw something that made hardened soldiers vomit in the streets. Not the pyramids, not the canals or floating gardens, or the sheer impossible scale of a city larger than most European capitals. What broke them psychologically were the walls. Walls, constructed from human skulls, tens of thousands of them, arranged in precise geometric patterns that demonstrated both mathematical sophistication and something the Spanish couldn't process as anything other than demonic. The tzompantli, skull racks, massive wooden structures in the ceremonial center of the city, displaying human remains the way we might display public art or war memorials. Except these weren't symbolic representations. These were actual skulls, carefully cleaned and prepared, mounted on horizontal poles that formed walls visible from across the city. Spanish accounts claim some racks held over 136,000 skulls. Modern historians debate those numbers. They seem impossibly high, exaggerated by men trying to justify conquest by describing savagery. But recent archaeological excavations under modern Mexico City have uncovered tzompantli foundations. And the skull counts, while perhaps not matching Spanish estimates exactly, confirm the basic horror. Yes, there were thousands. Yes, they were displayed publicly. Yes, this actually happened. What made the tzompantli truly disturbing wasn't just that they existed, it was that they were normal. Mothers walked past them while shopping in markets, holding their children's hands. Students passed them daily en routes to school. These weren't hidden atrocities tucked away where only priests could see. They were landmarks, architectural features integrated into city planning as casually as fountains or statues. Each skull represented a sacrifice. Warriors captured in battle, slaves purchased for that purpose. Criminals whose deaths served double duty as execution and offering. Occasionally volunteers who'd chosen sacrifice as the highest possible honor. The skulls were maintained carefully, almost lovingly. Priests would rotate them, removing ones that had decomposed too much, adding fresh ones, creating a constant refresh cycle that kept the displays perpetually updated. Archaeological evidence reveals something that makes this even stranger. The skulls weren't just from adult male warriors, as you might expect from a militaristic culture. They found skulls of women, children, various ages and social backgrounds. The tzompantli represented the full spectrum of humanity, all united in having fulfilled what Aztecs considered the ultimate purpose, feeding the gods. Children were taught to see these displays as beautiful, not metaphorically beautiful in some abstract sense, but genuinely, aesthetically pleasing. Evidence of their civilization's piety, proof that the gods were satisfied, confirmation that their society was functioning correctly. Walking past skull walls felt reassuring, not horrifying. It meant the cosmic order was being maintained. Specific ceremonies involved the tzompantli directly. Annual festivals where families could visit, searching for skulls that might belong to recently sacrificed relatives. This wasn't mourning as we understand it. Finding your relative's skull on the rack meant they'd achieved honor, their death properly integrated into the sacred architecture. Priests would circle the structures during certain rituals, chanting while the dead looked on. Offerings would be placed before particularly significant skulls, those belonging to famous warriors or nobles whose deaths had been especially meaningful. The displays served multiple purposes layered on top of each other. Religious devotion, obviously. Political intimidation. Visiting dignitaries from enemy cities would see those walls and understand very clearly what defeat meant. Cultural identity. We are the people who feed the gods, and here's the evidence measured in thousands of deaths. The paradox that should make us pause. The Aztecs demonstrated sophisticated urban planning that rival civilizations took centuries to match. They had advanced mathematics, astronomy that predicted celestial events with remarkable accuracy, literature and poetry of genuine sophistication. Yet they integrated mass human remains into their city architecture without apparent cognitive dissonance between advanced civilization and walls of skulls. When the Spanish destroyed Tenochtitlan, they were so disturbed by the Tzompantli that they systematically demolished them, buried the remains, tried to erase the evidence entirely. For centuries, the skull racks existed only in Spanish chronicles, which some historians suspected of exaggeration. But the skulls keep emerging. Construction projects in modern Mexico City regularly uncover them, buried under centuries of development, still arranged in patterns that confirm what the Spanish described. The Tzompantli were real, the displays were public, and somehow, children walked past them every day without psychological damage we'd consider inevitable. But the skull racks showed only the final result. Behind temple walls, away from public view, priests performed procedures on fresh bodies that revealed both remarkable medical knowledge and cultural practices we struggle to categorize. Behind the temple walls, where public ceremonies ended and sacred work began, specialized priests performed procedures that blurred every line between surgery, butchery, and religious ritual. These weren't regular priests. They were exo-chihua, trained from childhood in the precise dismemberment of human bodies, working with expertise that would impress modern forensic specialists. After sacrifice, the heart extraction performed publicly on pyramid tops, the body would be carried to these priests. What happened next was systematic, professional, and disturbingly sophisticated. The priests used obsidian blades sharper than modern surgical scalpels. Volcanic glass can be fractured to create edges only molecules thick, literally sharper than steel. With these tools, they would separate limbs at joints with precision that suggests detailed anatomical knowledge. Not hacking or sawing through bone, but finding the exact spaces where joints articulated and separating them cleanly. Organs would be removed and sorted according to religious protocols. The heart had already been taken during public ceremony. But the liver, intestines, other organs, each had specific destinations and purposes. Some would be offered to particular gods, some would be buried in specific temple locations. The sorting followed rules as precise as any modern medical procedure, except the categories were spiritual rather than biological. Skin was sometimes flayed entirely, removed in single sheets through cuts and careful separation from underlying tissue. These skins would be worn by priests during certain ceremonies, literal embodiment of the sacrificed person's essence. The procedure required skill and practice. Rushed flaying tears the skin. Proper technique, the kind these priests possessed, could remove skin intact, preserving it for ceremonial use that might last weeks. Skulls received special preparation for the Tzompantli. The flesh and brain needed removal without damaging the bone structure. Holes had to be drilled for mounting on the racks. The work was delicate, time-consuming, and performed regularly enough that these priests developed assembly line efficiency. Long bones were cleaned and sometimes converted into musical instruments or tools. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the body had sacred purpose and predetermined destination. This wasn't desecration from the Aztec perspective. It was consecration, proper treatment of remains that would serve the gods in multiple forms. The Aztec priests possessed remarkably detailed anatomical knowledge. They could identify and name specific organs. They understood that blood circulated, though their conceptual framework differed from modern physiology. They recognized that different organs had different properties, different spiritual essences that required different handling. Children from priestly families began training young, learning to view human bodies as sacred objects requiring proper processing rather than as individuals who once lived. The psychological conditioning necessary to dismember human bodies regularly, without emotional damage, was installed early and reinforced constantly through religious framework that made the work holy rather than horrifying. The tools themselves were specialized, flaying knives with specific blade shapes, bone saws designed for particular cuts, collection vessels for different types of blood and fluids, because various bodily fluids had different ritual uses. Spanish conquistadors discovered rooms full of these tools and were horrified by what they represented. Professionalized, systematic dismemberment as standard religious practice. Here's something that should disturb modern sensibilities. Aztec knowledge of dead anatomy far exceeded their understanding of living anatomy. They knew precisely how bodies came apart, but were less sophisticated about treating living injuries or diseases. Religious taboos likely limited experimentation on the living, while religious obligation provided unlimited practice on the dead. The controversial topic we can't avoid, ritual cannibalism. Scholarly debate continues about extent and meaning, but both Spanish sources and indigenous accounts confirm it occurred in specific contexts. Portions of sacrificed warriors would sometimes be distributed to the captor's family, cooked using traditional methods, and consumed as communion with divine energy rather than as food source. Not all sacrifices. Not by everyone. But it happened, documented too consistently, across too many sources to dismiss as Spanish propaganda. When the Spanish executed captured Aztec priests, they specifically targeted ex-Ochihua, attempting to eliminate those who possessed this knowledge. Yet ironically, Spanish priests later consulted with surviving Aztec anatomists when European medical knowledge proved insufficient for treating certain conditions or understanding biological principles the Aztecs had discovered through their religious dismemberment practices. But not all Aztec deaths involved sacrifice and dismemberment. Common people died ordinary deaths, and what happened to those bodies reveals an entirely different relationship with the afterlife. One where how you died mattered infinitely more than how you lived. The Aztecs didn't believe good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. That framework, the idea that moral behavior determines afterlife destination, would have seemed strange to them. What mattered wasn't whether you lived righteously. What mattered was how you died. The afterlife had multiple realms, each reserved for specific types of death. Mictlan, the dark underworld, waited for those who died naturally. Disease, old age, accidents that didn't involve water. This wasn't punishment exactly, but it wasn't paradise either. Souls would journey for 4 years through increasingly difficult obstacles before finally reaching their destination and dissolving into nothing. Tlalocan, paradise of the rain god, received those who drowned or died from water-related illness. Lightning strikes, floods, diseases associated with water. These deaths meant entering an eternal realm of abundance, comfort, and peace. Drowning victims were envied, their deaths considered fortunate accidents that guaranteed the best possible afterlife. Tonatiuh Hichan, the sun's realm, was reserved for warriors who died in combat or were sacrificed, and women who died in childbirth. The Aztecs understood childbirth as warfare, women battling death to bring forth life. Women who lost that battle received the same honor as warriors who fell in actual combat. Their souls would accompany the sun on its daily journey, a continuation of service beyond death. Sincalco, the infant realm, received children who died young, a separate afterlife for those who never reached adulthood, though accounts of what happened there remain frustratingly vague in surviving sources. These beliefs shaped how bodies were treated. Drowning victims weren't cremated like other dead. They were buried with water imagery, shells, blue pigments, everything symbolizing their destination in Tlalocan. Warriors were cremated with their weapons, shields, everything they'd need to continue serving in the afterlife. Women who died in childbirth received burials at crossroads. Not because crossroads were sacred, but because the Aztecs believed these women's ghosts would haunt those locations, searching for living children to steal. The belief created genuine fear. Parents would avoid crossroads during certain times, protecting their children from spirits driven mad by maternal instinct denied. Funeral preparations for natural deaths involved elaborate rituals spanning years. The body would be positioned according to its destination, different positions for different afterlife realms. Food, tools, possessions would be buried with them, supplies for the 4-year journey through Mictlan's obstacles. Sometimes a dog would be sacrificed and buried with the person, because crossing one of Mictlan's rivers required a dog to carry the soul across. Grief practices would shock modern mourners. The deceased's possessions were destroyed, not kept as mementos. Keeping belongings would trap the soul, preventing its journey. Mourners would shave their heads, cover faces with ash, sometimes perform bloodletting as expression of loss, but excessive grief was dangerous. Too much mourning could bind the soul to the living world, condemning it to wander rather than proceeding to its proper destination. Families were encouraged to grieve intensely but briefly, then completely sever emotional attachment. This wasn't cruelty but necessity. The dead needed release, not continued connection. Death manner determined social consequences for surviving families. A warrior's death brought honor, elevated family status, provided bragging rights. Natural death from disease or age brought nothing. No honor, no elevated status, just loss. This created perverse incentive for elderly or ill individuals to volunteer for sacrifice rather than die wastefully from natural causes. The Aztecs believed the afterlife journey was literal, not metaphorical. Souls would cross rivers, navigate between mountains that crashed together periodically, traverse fields of obsidian knives that cut anyone attempting passage. Families performed regular rituals to help offerings at specific intervals, prayers to ease particular obstacles, ceremonies marking progress through the 4-year journey. This geography of death shaped how people lived. They didn't fear death itself, they feared dying the wrong way. Drowning became something some people actively sought, knowing it guaranteed paradise. Natural death from disease became something to avoid if possible, motivating some to volunteer for sacrifice when illness became terminal. The Aztec relationship with death was complex, sophisticated, and utterly alien to modern Western thinking. Death wasn't the end. It was transformation into a journey whose destination depended entirely on the circumstances of your final moments, not the accumulated choices of your entire life. But death, complex as it was, represented only one aspect of Aztec life. Nothing shaped daily existence more profoundly than the institutions controlling sexuality, reproduction, and family structure. Aztec teenagers didn't date. They didn't flirt in markets or exchange glances during festivals, or develop crushes that kept them awake at night, wondering if feelings were reciprocated. They didn't choose partners. That choice belonged to priests who consulted astronomical charts and calculated calendrical compatibility, determining which strangers would spend their lives together based on the day they were born. When children reached adolescence, families began consulting with Cihuatlanc, matchmaker priests, who possessed specialized knowledge of how birth dates interacted cosmically. These weren't casual consultations. They were serious negotiations that could take years, involving detailed examination of family histories, astronomical calculations, and divination rituals designed to confirm whether the proposed union would please the gods or anger them. The calendar determined everything. 2 people born on incompatible day signs simply could not marry, regardless of personal feelings, family desire, or practical considerations. Their union would create cosmic imbalance, angering deities, and inviting disaster not just for the couple, but for their entire community. The matchmaker priests maintained complex charts, showing which day signs complemented each other and which combinations were forbidden under any circumstances. Marriage negotiations involved exchanges that we'd recognize as economic transactions. The groom's family would provide textiles, jewelry, household goods. The bride's family might provide laborers, land rights, other resources. These weren't gifts in any sentimental sense. They were investments establishing economic ties between families that would persist for generations. The process followed memorized protocols, formal speeches delivered in specific language that couldn't be altered or improvised, gifts presented in prescribed order, divination rituals at scheduled intervals to confirm divine approval at each stage. Parents controlled every aspect. In many cases, the couple didn't meet until the wedding ceremony itself, seeing each other for the first time when their lives were already legally and religiously bound together. The wedding ceremony was a multi-day affair combining fasting, bloodletting, elaborate costumes, and rituals designed to invoke divine blessing. The bride would be carried to the groom's house at night, torchlight procession through streets, arriving at a home she'd never seen to meet a family who were now legally hers. Inside, the couple would sit together on a special mat, while older relatives delivered hours-long speeches about marital duties, responsibilities, the importance of fulfilling roles correctly. These weren't warm welcome speeches. They were instruction manuals delivered verbally, explaining precisely what each person was now required to do for the rest of their lives. The symbolic tying of the couple's clothing together formed the legal bond. Their garments literally knotted, while priests chanted prophecies about their future, not hopes or blessings, but predictions based on their birth dates about how many children they'd have, what hardships they'd face when disaster might strike. Breaking this bond later wasn't just divorce, it was religious violation requiring ritual correction. Class determined scale and complexity. Noble marriages were political alliances that could affect entire regions. Ambassadors might attend. Gifts would include exotic goods from across the empire. The ceremonies would last weeks, involving hundreds of guests and elaborate ritual sequences. Commoner marriages were simpler, but followed the same basic framework. Smaller gifts, shorter ceremonies, fewer witnesses. But the same calendrical calculations, the same arranged nature, the same lack of personal choice about who you'd spend your life with. Polygamy was permitted for nobles and wealthy merchants. Some lords maintained dozens of wives in separate households, hundreds of concubines, creating family networks so complex they required administrators to manage. But common people practiced monogamy not from moral principle, but economic necessity. Supporting multiple wives required resources most families simply didn't possess. Despite the arranged nature, Aztec society wasn't completely rigid about marital success. Couples who proved infertile could divorce and remarry. Specific prayers and rituals existed to increase fertility, suggesting that while choice of partner was controlled, the success of that partnership mattered practically. The wedding ceremony, elaborate as it was, represented only the beginning. What happened inside Aztec households, after the torches were extinguished and the speeches ended, revealed daily realities that made the arranged marriage seem almost generous by comparison. Aztec marriage wasn't partnership. It was parallel existence under one roof. Two people fulfilling gendered roles so strictly defined that decades of cohabitation didn't necessarily create what we'd recognize as intimacy or companionship. The physical structures reflected this separation. Commoner homes were typically single rooms where entire families lived without privacy. Noble homes had more space but maintained strict gendered areas. Men's spaces, women's spaces, rarely overlapping except for specific ritualized interactions. Women's work defined their existence, hours every day grinding corn on metates, heavy stone grinders that required full-body effort. Kneel before the stone, push, grind, thousands of repetitions daily. Archaeological examination of female skeletons from Aztec sites reveals permanent skeletal deformation from this work. Spinal changes, knee damage, arm bones thickened from constant pressure. You can identify women's remains by what corn grinding did to their bodies over lifetimes. Textile work was equally central. Women wove cloth for family use and tribute obligations. This wasn't hobby or optional skill, it was fundamental female identity. Girls who refused to learn weaving could be killed by their own families for bringing shame to the household. The refusal suggested moral corruption, failure of basic female essence. Men's work varied by class: farmers in fields, craftsmen in workshops, warriors in training, merchants on trade routes. But regardless of specific occupation, men participated in communal labor projects and maintained readiness for military service. The empire's infrastructure, roads, temples, irrigation systems, was built through mandatory male labor contributions. Marriage didn't create partnership between these parallel existences. Husbands and wives ate separately. They slept on different mats. They maintained distinct social circles with limited overlap. Physical intimacy was ritualized and calendrically prescribed. Certain day signs were unlucky for conception, meaning couples had to abstain regardless of personal desire. Sex wasn't spontaneous or romantic. It was scheduled activity governed by cosmic calculations. Husbands possessed legal authority to physically punish wives for domestic failures. This wasn't considered abuse, but legitimate correction of household management problems. However, wives who could prove severe or excessive punishment could seek divorce through local councils, suggesting some limits existed, even if those limits were far beyond what modern sensibilities would tolerate. Privacy, as a concept, barely existed. Aztec communities maintained systems of block captains who monitored households, reported domestic disputes, noted suspicious behaviors, or failures in religious observance. Your neighbors knew your business because they were required to know it, required to report it. The household wasn't private sanctuary. It was smallest unit of state surveillance. Child rearing reflected this gendered division. Mothers were primary caregivers until children reached age 4 or 5. Then fathers took responsibility for boys' education and training, while mothers continued with girls. The transition was sharp, sometimes traumatic, but necessary for proper gendering according to Aztec values. Emotional displays of affection between spouses were discouraged publicly. Marriage was duty, obligation, economic and religious contract. Love might develop, but it wasn't the point. The relationship existed to produce children, maintain household economy, fulfill social obligations. Personal feelings were irrelevant to these purposes. This created emotional lives almost impossible for modern people to fully grasp. Couples who shared decades, raised multiple children, managed households together, yet never developed what we'd recognize as intimate partnership. They might never have had extended private conversation, never shared thoughts about hopes or fears or dreams. They existed adjacently, fulfilling roles, never quite connecting as individuals. Yet paradoxically, widows and widowers were expected to show extreme grief at spouse's death. Elaborate mourning rituals, visible suffering, social performance of loss. This suggests emotional bonds did form, but they were expressed differently than modern relationships. Perhaps loving someone you never really knew as an individual, grieving the loss of familiar presence rather than intimate connection. Divorce was legally possible, but economically catastrophic. All marriage gifts had to be returned. Family alliances required renegotiation. The social fallout affected everyone connected to both families. Primary acceptable grounds were infertility, severe adultery by wives, or incompatibility so extreme it prevented basic household function. Some evidence suggests genuine affection occasionally developed despite systemic obstacles. Poetry fragments reference spousal love. Archaeological sites show some couples buried together by choice rather than requirement. But these were exceptions notable precisely because they violated cultural norms, treating marriage as contract rather than emotional partnership. Behind these formal marriages, hidden in shadows these rigid structures created, existed an entirely different world of sexuality that official culture condemned but couldn't eliminate. A world where desire refused to follow rules written by priests and enforced by death. Aztec law stated clearly that women caught in adultery would be stoned to death publicly, their bodies left unburied as warnings to others contemplating similar violations. Yet adultery cases were so common that execution schedules became routine, because even under threat of death, desire refused to follow the rules priests had written. Official Aztec culture promoted strict sexual morality. Marriage was sacred contract. Sexuality outside prescribed boundaries was cosmic violation. The laws were harsh, the punishments horrific. Yet evidence suggests reality was far more complex, shadowy world of forbidden sexuality existing alongside official morality. Adultery by wives was capital crime. Both parties, the wife and her lover, faced execution, typically by stoning or strangulation. Public events designed to terrorize anyone contemplating similar actions. Yet legal records from surviving codices show constant cases. Not occasional scandals, but regular occurrences requiring systematic judicial response. The frequency suggests either Aztec women were extraordinarily rebellious, or the enforcement was inconsistent enough that people gambled with the odds. Male homosexuality was officially condemned with extreme prejudice. The active partner would be burned alive. The passive partner would be disemboweled, his body covered in ash. Punishments designed to be so horrific, they'd prevent the practice entirely. Yet archaeological evidence confirms homosexual activity existed. Some surviving artwork includes homoerotic imagery. Some scholars argue certain priestly roles may have involved accepted forms of male-male sexuality, disguised as religious practice, though this interpretation remains controversial. Prostitution occupied a strange legal grey zone. Ahuyani professional prostitutes were technically condemned by official morality, but operated openly in market areas and certain neighborhoods. Traveling merchants and warriors patronized them without apparent legal consequence. These women paid tribute to local authorities, suggesting semi-official tolerance. Some were enslaved. Others were widows, divorced women, or those rejected by families and left with few economic alternatives. The double standard was profound and deliberate. Male sexual experience outside marriage, especially for warriors, was unofficially tolerated or even encouraged. Men gained status through multiple conquests, battlefield and sexual, but female sexuality outside marriage meant death or slavery. Married men frequented prostitutes openly, while their wives could be executed for inappropriate glances at other men. This hypocrisy created culture of male privilege and female danger. Women navigated daily life, knowing that accusations, even false ones, could result in execution. Men navigated life, knowing their sexual transgressions would likely be ignored or treated as minor infractions. Underground knowledge networks existed for managing forbidden sexuality. Certain plants served as aphrodisiacs or contraceptives. Women who knew which plants prevented pregnancy or induced abortion passed this knowledge secretly. Parallel medical system for managing consequences of sexuality that official culture pretended didn't exist outside marriage. Some noble women wielded sexual power through official channels. Sequential marriages after widowhood allowed them to accumulate political influence. Marrying multiple important men over a lifetime, they built networks of family connections that gave them authority their unmarried sisters couldn't access. Spanish chroniclers documented Aztec sexual practices with fascination masquerading as moral outrage. Their codices include extensive descriptions of sexual taboos, positions, practices. Modern historians suspect the Spanish used this documentation to justify conquest. Look how depraved these people are, while being voyeuristically obsessed with the details. Aztec children received explicit sexual education, not mysterious or hidden, but openly discussed within framework of extreme consequences for deviation. Children learned about reproduction mechanically. They witnessed public executions of adulterers, visceral education about what happened when desire violated rules. They memorized lists of forbidden practices and associated punishments. This created culture where everyone knew the rules. Many broke them anyway, and enforcement was inconsistent enough that people gambled with their lives, pursuing desires official culture condemned. Sex became form of rebellion, desire itself an act of individual will in society designed to eliminate individual choice. These forbidden desires represented small acts of personal autonomy in culture that denied individuality. But the ultimate denial of individual will came not from marriage or sexuality. It came from institutions that literally owned human beings, that made people property with no autonomy at all. Aztec slavery was about to reveal complexities that make modern understanding of slavery seem simplistic by comparison. Approximately 30% of the Aztec population lived in bondage at any given time. But Aztec slavery was so radically different from what that word conjures in modern minds that using the same term almost feels misleading. This wasn't racial slavery. It wasn't necessarily hereditary. It wasn't always permanent. Yet in some ways, it was more psychologically devastating, precisely because the boundaries between slave and free were so blurred that no one was ever entirely certain where they stood. There were multiple pathways into slavery. Debt bondage was most common. Someone who couldn't repay what they owed could sell themselves or family members into servitude until the debt was satisfied. Criminal enslavement served as punishment for theft or other offenses. War captivity provided steady supply of enslaved people from conquered territories. And strangest of all, voluntary enslavement, where people sold themselves during famines or hardships to ensure survival through guaranteed food and shelter. Here's where Aztec slavery becomes conceptually strange. Slaves could own property, including other slaves. They could marry free people, and their children would be born free rather than inheriting enslaved status. They could accumulate wealth, operate businesses, and eventually buy their freedom if they earned enough. Some slaves lived better than free commoners, with comfortable housing, adequate food, and relatively light labor if they possessed valuable skills and benevolent masters. The legal framework treated slavery as contractual relationship with defined terms. When someone entered slavery, the contract specified what labor they'd perform. Agricultural work, domestic service, carrying goods for merchants. Masters couldn't force slaves into work outside these agreed terms without renegotiating the contract. This created strange situations where slaves might refuse certain tasks, citing contractual limitations, and have legal standing to do so. Slave markets operated openly in major cities. Buyers could inspect potential purchases, examining strength, health, skills. The scenes sound horrifyingly familiar to anyone who knows the history of transatlantic slavery, except with the bizarre twist that some people shopping in these markets were themselves slaves, purchasing other slaves to manage on behalf of their masters or even for their own use. Slaves weren't marked permanently. They didn't wear distinctive clothing or bear brands identifying their status. They could walk freely through cities, conduct business, interact with free people without obvious indicators of bondage. This invisibility of status created constant social uncertainty. You couldn't always tell who was slave and who was free just by observing them. The psychological complexity was profound. Slaves existed in permanent precarity. Their masters could sell them at any moment, to anyone, for any reason. They had no ultimate control over their lives or futures despite the apparent freedoms the system allowed. And because slavery wasn't clearly visible or permanently marked on bodies, the line between enslaved and free became fractal in complexity. Someone could simultaneously own slaves while being debt-bonded to someone else, creating layers of obligation and ownership that defied simple categorization. Personal freedom wasn't binary state, but conditional status that could change rapidly based on economic circumstances, legal judgments, or simple misfortune. Slavery was so normalized that religious texts treated it as natural and necessary for social order. Gods themselves were described in mythological accounts as having slaves, suggesting even divine beings required this economic arrangement. No one seriously questioned whether slavery should exist, only how it should be managed and what protections slaves deserved within the system. But here's the darkest aspect that makes Aztec slavery uniquely disturbing. While most slaves served mundane economic functions, some were explicitly purchased for eventual sacrifice. They would live for months, sometimes years, knowing they'd been bought for ritual death. During this waiting period, they'd be treated well, fed quality food, given decent housing. Not from kindness, but from religious necessity. Sacrifice victims needed to be healthy, their bodies unblemished, their spirits not broken by obvious cruelty. This created an economic category almost impossible to process with modern ethical frameworks. Luxury sacrifice victims. People purchased not for their labor but for their deaths, maintained in good condition until the calendar determined their time had come. They would walk the same streets as other slaves, outwardly indistinguishable, knowing their bondage would end not in freedom, but on a pyramid with an obsidian blade. Even slaves with property, with families, with apparent freedom, lived under this shadow. Any slave could potentially be sold for sacrifice if their master chose or circumstances demanded. The possibility lurked in the background of every enslaved person's consciousness, making psychological freedom impossible even when practical freedoms existed. And this brings us to what made that possibility so terrifying: the sheer scale and systematic organization of human sacrifice in Tenochtitlan. Human sacrifice in Tenochtitlan wasn't chaotic religious frenzy, it was bureaucratic. The Aztec Empire maintained professional infrastructure for processing thousands of human deaths annually, with scheduling systems, holding facilities, training programs, and waste management protocols that would be impressive if they weren't so horrifying. Estimates of annual sacrifice numbers vary wildly among scholars. Conservative estimates suggest 1,000 people per year in Tenochtitlan alone. Higher estimates reach 20,000. The truth likely falls somewhere between, though special occasions could see hundreds sacrificed in single ceremonies lasting from dawn to dusk. This scale required supply chains. Captive warriors came from specific flower wars, pre-arranged ritual battles between allied cities designed not to conquer territory, but to capture victims for mutual sacrifice. Both sides would fight. Both sides would take prisoners. Both sides would sacrifice their captives in their respective temples. Warfare as supplier of religious inventory, rather than tool of expansion. Slaves were purchased from markets specifically for sacrifice. Certain merchants specialized in this trade, traveling extensively to find suitable victims, Criminals were diverted from prisons to temples, their punishments transformed into religious service. And volunteers were recruited, though likely with significant social pressure and religious conditioning, making voluntary a complicated term. Managing this, many bodies required infrastructure most people never think about when imagining Aztec sacrifice. Holding facilities where victims waited, sometimes for months. Feeding systems to keep them healthy. Guard rotations to prevent escape. Religious preparation protocols, bathing rituals, special foods, costume and body painting according to which god they'd represent. Some victims received drugs or alcohol, possibly to induce compliance or alter consciousness, making their deaths easier psychologically, if not physically. The treatment of victims was paradoxical. They were simultaneously sacred offerings and doomed prisoners, honored and confined, fed fine foods while awaiting certain death. Warriors captured in battle often accepted their fate with cultural conditioning that framed sacrifice as honorable conclusion to a warrior's life. Purchased slaves likely experienced it very differently, their terror masked by ritualized treatment that insisted this was religious duty rather than murder. The sacrifice calendar was meticulously managed. Certain gods demanded offerings on specific days throughout the year. Priests maintained schedules, ensuring proper timing, adequate supply, appropriate preparation. Major festivals required mass sacrifices that functioned almost like assembly lines. Victims waiting in lines up pyramid steps. Priests working in shifts to maintain pace. All-day ceremonies that demanded stamina from everyone involved. The physical reality was brutally practical. Pyramid steps became slick with blood, requiring specialized cleaning crews to prevent accidents. Systems for moving bodies from sacrifice platforms to processing areas operated with efficiency born from constant practice. Different disposal methods for different types of sacrifice. Some bodies burned, some dismembered for ritual distribution, some thrown into sacred cenotes where they remain today, visible to archaeologists exploring underwater caves. Young priests learned sacrifice procedures through apprenticeship. Starting as assistants, they'd eventually practice heart extraction techniques, first on animals, eventually on human bodies. The training developed both technical skill and emotional detachment necessary to kill multiple people in a day without psychological breakdown. This was specialized profession, requiring specific expertise and psychological conditioning. Heart extraction, the iconic image of Aztec sacrifice, wasn't always instant death. Obsidian blades were incredibly sharp, but the technique required precision. Opening the chest, reaching through ribs, severing vessels while extracting the still-beating heart demanded practice. Bungled sacrifices meant prolonged suffering, though priests trained extensively to minimize this. Scholars debate whether Spanish chroniclers exaggerated sacrifice numbers to justify conquest. Recent archaeological evidence provides partial answers. Mass grave sites, chemical analysis of temple floors revealing extensive blood residue, skeletal remains showing signs of heart extraction, all suggest the Spanish accounts, while possibly inflated, were grounded in reality. The scale was genuinely massive. The sacrifice system was so embedded in Aztec economics, politics, and social structure that ending it would have collapsed the civilization. It wasn't just religious practice. It was the central organizing principle of everything. Warfare existed to capture victims. Social hierarchy was reinforced through sacrifice participation. Political power derived partially from controlling sacrifice logistics. Religious authority rested on managing relationships with gods who demanded blood. This raises the question that makes Aztec sacrifice even more disturbing than simple religious zealotry would suggest. Why? What purposes did this system serve beyond theology? The Aztecs genuinely believed sacrifice was cosmically necessary. Gods required human energy to maintain reality itself. Failure to provide it would cause universal collapse into darkness. This wasn't metaphor. It was literal belief backed by astronomical observation, mythological texts interpreted by trained specialists, and centuries of cultural reinforcement. Religious sincerity was real, but sacrifice served so many additional functions that even if religious belief had somehow weakened, other motivations would have sustained the system. It was overdetermined, useful in too many ways to eliminate, even if theology became questionable. Political function was obvious. Sacrifice was spectacular state propaganda, demonstrating Aztec power, divine favor, and willingness to do what other civilizations wouldn't. Neighboring cities and potential enemies were invited to witness major sacrifices. The message was unmistakable and intentional. Submit to Aztec authority, or this could be you, your family, your entire city. The terror induced by these displays helped maintain the tribute system that funded the empire without requiring constant military intervention. Economic function operated more subtly. Sacrifice redistributed, captured warriors and criminals who would otherwise destabilize society. Instead of feeding imprisoned enemies indefinitely or risking their escape and rebellion, the system converted them into religious capital. They were removed from potential threat status and transformed into offerings that reinforced state legitimacy. Some scholars argue sacrifice served as population control during resource scarcity, though evidence for this remains controversial and debated. Psychological function penetrated deepest. Sacrifice gave meaning to death in a culture with high mortality rates. Warriors sought capture for sacrifice over anonymous battlefield death because sacrifice guaranteed honorable afterlife and social recognition. Parents who lost children to disease could frame loss as divine will rather than random tragedy. The system transformed unavoidable suffering into cosmic significance. Sacrifice shaped Aztec personality in fundamental ways. It created culture that valued stoicism over emotional expression, that devalued individual life in favor of collective religious participation, that found meaning through subordinating personal survival to greater purposes. Regular exposure to sacrifice from childhood normalized death and pain, making literal personal death easier to accept when your time came. The darker possibility lingers. Did priests cynically manipulate belief to maintain their power and privilege? Evidence suggests both genuine faith and calculated politics coexisted comfortably. Priests likely believed their theological framework, while also recognizing how useful it was for maintaining social control, economic stability, and their own elevated status. Religious sincerity and political manipulation weren't contradictory. They reinforced each other. The anthropological debate about sacrifice serving nutritional purposes refuses to disappear completely. The controversial cannibalism hypothesis suggests protein scarcity made ritual consumption of sacrificed flesh practically necessary, not just religiously meaningful. Evidence for systematic nutritional cannibalism remains weak. But the fact that some sacrificed flesh was ritually consumed means nutrition and religion weren't entirely separate categories. The Aztecs may not have sacrificed for food, but they did sometimes eat what they sacrificed, blurring lines between sacred and practical. Trying to identify a single explanation for Aztec sacrifice misses the essential point. The system was overdetermined precisely because it served multiple functions simultaneously. It was religious devotion and political control, and economic management, and psychological coping mechanism, and social organization principle all at once. This redundancy of purpose made it nearly impossible to eliminate. If one rationale had failed or been challenged, others would have sustained the practice. When the Spanish outlawed sacrifice, they didn't just end a religious practice. They collapsed the central meaning-making system that structured Aztec politics, warfare, social hierarchy, psychological frameworks, and cosmic understanding. The prohibition created cultural void that has never been entirely filled. Modern descendants of Aztecs still grapple with integrating this history into contemporary identity, trying to honor ancestors while acknowledging practices modern ethics condemn. The function sacrifice served meaning-making, social control, death acceptance, collective identity don't disappear when the specific practice ends. They get redirected into different systems, different practices, different frameworks. But the human needs that made sacrifice functional remain, finding new expressions in every culture that comes after. Understanding sacrifice logistics and purposes doesn't answer the most human question. What was it like to live knowing that you, your children, your neighbors, might be selected at any moment? How did ordinary Aztecs psychologically survive in a society where death wasn't just inevitable, but institutionalized, scheduled, transformed into civic duty? From an Aztec perspective, their society wasn't horrifying. It was normal, sacred, necessary. This is the crucial point that modern minds struggle to grasp. Children born into this system didn't experience it as trauma. They experienced it as reality, the only reality they'd ever known or could imagine. Enculturation began before memory. Infants heard songs about sacrifice while being rocked to sleep. Toddlers learned rhymes about feeding the gods before they could fully walk. By the time children could speak in complete sentences, they could recite prayers explaining why blood must be offered every morning to ensure the sun would rise. These weren't frightening bedtime stories. They were lullabies, nursery rhymes, foundational education delivered with the same gentle affection parents everywhere show their children. Public ceremonies reinforced private teaching. Children attended sacrifices not as hidden horrors, but as community festivals. They watched, asked questions, received answers that framed what they'd seen as beautiful service to cosmic order. By adolescence, questioning whether sacrifice was necessary would have felt like questioning whether breathing was necessary. Both were simply what humans did to stay alive. The psychological mechanisms allowing this normalization have modern names that the Aztecs didn't possess, but experienced nonetheless. Dissociation allowed priests who performed hundreds of sacrifices to develop emotional numbness that enabled continued function. Not cruelty, but protective detachment that modern trauma surgeons would recognize. You can't maintain empathetic connection with every person you kill and remain psychologically intact, so the mind creates distance. Rationalization transformed killing into sacred duty. Every death served cosmic purpose. Therefore, what looked like murder from outside perspective was actually profound religious service from inside the framework. The distinction between killing and murder was absolute and unbridgeable. Killing in service of the gods wasn't morally equivalent to killing for personal reasons. The categories didn't even overlap. Meaning-making reframed suffering as divine communication. Pain wasn't random or cruel. It was God's testing devotion, strengthening souls, preparing individuals for greater service. Fear wasn't weakness, but appropriate reverence for cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. Aztec society had virtually no concept of trauma as we understand it. Repeated exposure to violence and death wasn't considered damaging. It was spiritually fortifying, character building, evidence of proper cultural conditioning. Warriors who'd killed many enemies and watched many comrades die weren't viewed as psychologically wounded. They were honored veterans whose experiences qualified them for leadership and respect. This created cultural personality marked by stoicism, acceptance of suffering, emotional restraint. Spanish conquistadors noted these traits, sometimes with grudging admiration, sometimes with disturbed fascination. How could people witness such horrors and remain so composed? The answer was that Aztecs didn't see horrors. They saw religious duty performed correctly. Yet they weren't emotionless. They laughed, loved, created art and poetry of genuine sophistication. Parents raised children with evident affection. Friends shared bonds of loyalty. The capacity for warmth and connection existed fully alongside the capacity to participate in mass killing without apparent cognitive dissonance. The cultural framework separated these activities so completely that they didn't create internal conflict. Modern descendants of Aztecs grapple with this legacy in complex ways. Indigenous Mexican communities maintain many pre-Columbian traditions while explicitly rejecting sacrifice. They practice selective cultural continuity, choosing which aspects of ancestral practices to preserve and which to condemn through contemporary ethical frameworks. The tension between honoring ancestors and acknowledging that those ancestors did things modern ethics find unconscionable creates ongoing identity struggles. Anthropologists studying societies with normalized violence observe similar patterns across cultures and time periods. Humans possess remarkable capacity to adapt to atrocity when cultural narratives provide meaning and when alternatives seem literally inconceivable. This isn't unique to Aztecs. It's fundamental human psychology that every culture demonstrates in different forms. The Spanish conquest created different trauma than one might expect, not from ending sacrifice itself, which some Aztecs may have ambivalently accepted, but from destroying the meaning-making frameworks that rendered Aztec life comprehensible. When sacrifice ended, it revealed retrospectively that all those deaths hadn't actually prevented cosmic catastrophe. The sun rose without blood offerings. The world continued without human hearts feeding the gods. That revelation that none of it had been necessary may have been more psychologically devastating than the violence itself ever was. But ending violence didn't end fear. The Aztecs feared witches more than death. They feared divine anger more than disease. And they feared demons descending from the stars during eclipses, waiting to devour humanity if even one ritual was performed incorrectly. The material world, dangerous as it was, represented only a fraction of the threats occupying Aztec consciousness. The cosmos was populated by entities far beyond the major gods whose names survived in colonial records. Countless beings occupied invisible realms adjacent to material reality, constantly interacting with the living in ways both helpful and catastrophically harmful. Siwa Teteo haunted crossroads. The ghosts of women who died in childbirth, trapped between worlds, driven mad by maternal instinct denied. They attacked living children, trying to steal them, replace them, satisfy the parenting urge that death had interrupted. Parents avoided crossroads during certain times, particularly at night, protecting their children from spirits who couldn't distinguish between love and destruction. Tzitzimitl were skeletal star demons who descended during solar eclipses. These weren't metaphorical demons, but actual entities the Aztecs believed, weighted above the world, held back only by cosmic order, maintained through proper ritual. An eclipse represented that order fragmenting temporarily. If rituals had been performed incorrectly, if offerings were insufficient, the Tzitzimitl might break through permanently and devour all humanity. Every eclipse brought genuine terror that this might be the failure point, the moment when darkness won. Tlaloque were rain spirits, whose satisfaction determined whether crops grew or failed. Too much rain brought floods, too little brought famine. The balance required constant management through offerings and prayers, never certain whether you'd done enough until harvest either succeeded or failed. Agricultural uncertainty became spiritual warfare, farmers battling invisible entities through ritual rather than practical technique alone. Daily life required constant vigilance. Certain times of day were dangerous. Certain places harbored malevolent spirits. Certain actions invited divine punishment, even if they seemed practically necessary. Protective measures included amulets worn constantly, prayers recited before major activities, bloodletting to demonstrate devotion, avoiding unlucky calendar days regardless of practical inconvenience, staying out of specific locations at specific times. Ticitl were healers who treated illnesses caused by witchcraft, divine anger, or soul loss. Conditions requiring ritual treatment rather than herbal medicine, though the line between categories was blurry. If you got sick and plant medicines didn't work, the illness might be spiritual attack requiring entirely different intervention. The Aztecs believed in tonali life force that could be stolen by witches or evil spirits. Unexplained illness meant your tonali had been compromised. Bad luck suggested someone was draining your life energy. Personality changes indicated soul damage, requiring immediate ritual correction. This created culture of suspicion. Misfortune had to come from somewhere. Random chance wasn't satisfying explanation. Someone must be causing your suffering through supernatural means, probably a neighbor or rival using forbidden knowledge. Parents obsessed over protecting children's tonally. Specific rituals marked developmental stages, reinforcing and protecting the life force as children grew. Adults consulted diviners before major decisions, ensuring they weren't acting during cosmically inauspicious times that would guarantee failure regardless of practical planning. The supernatural threat matrix served social control functions alongside genuine belief. Deviance from social norms could be framed as evidence of witchcraft. Communities could police behavior by accusing troublesome members of spiritual crimes that justified punishment or exile. The line between sincere religious fear and cynical social manipulation was deliberately kept unclear. Spanish missionaries recognized and exploited this existing framework. They didn't have to convince Aztecs that invisible spiritual forces existed and required devotion. That belief was already embedded deeply. Missionaries just redirected it. Aztec gods became demons. Christian God became the proper object of worship. The psychological structure remained nearly identical, while the specific entities changed names and allegiances. These supernatural fears, unlike sacrifice, didn't disappear with conquest. Many rural Mexican communities still maintain versions of these beliefs. Curanderos still practice, treating illnesses understood as spiritual attacks. People still consult them about bad luck, relationship problems, business failures, all framed as potentially caused by witchcraft or divine displeasure. The supernatural threat matrix shapes daily life in ways outsiders barely notice, but participants navigate constantly. Avoid certain places at certain times. Perform protective rituals before important activities. Watch for signs that invisible forces are turning against you. Respond immediately when bad luck suggests supernatural attack. Living with invisible enemies created psychological burden. Modern secular worldviews struggle to appreciate. You couldn't fight what you couldn't see. You couldn't predict attacks that followed spiritual logic rather than material cause and effect. You could only perform rituals, hope they were sufficient, and live with constant low-grade anxiety that supernatural forces might destroy you at any moment. But even these fears were overshadowed by one ultimate terror. The Aztecs knew with absolute certainty that their world would end, not metaphorically, not eventually in some distant abstraction, but definitely, catastrophically, in earthquakes that would tear reality apart. They just didn't know when. 4 worlds had come before, 4 suns, each created and destroyed as gods experimented with existence. The first sun ended when jaguars devoured humanity. The second sun was destroyed by hurricanes. The third sun burned in fire. The fourth sun drowned in floods. Each apocalypse was total, wiping away civilizations and starting over. The fifth sun, the current world, the one the Aztecs inhabited, would end in earthquakes. This wasn't religious speculation, it was historical pattern. 4 previous apocalypses established the precedent. The fifth was coming. Not if, but when. This uncertainty about timing created perpetual existential crisis. Might be today, might be centuries away. Every earthquake hinted that the final destruction was beginning. Calendar priests constantly watched for ominous signs. Astronomical events were interpreted as potential apocalypse warnings. Natural disasters confirmed that the end was approaching. Cosmic order fragmenting in preparation for ultimate collapse. Every 52 years, the Aztec calendar completed a full cycle. These transitions were feared as potential endpoints. The new fire ceremony that marked calendar completion involved extinguishing every fire throughout the empire. Not symbolically, literally every fire, in every home, every temple, every hearth. Pottery and household goods were destroyed. People spent the night in absolute darkness, waiting in terror to see if the sun would rise again, or if this cycle's end marked the end of everything. When dawn came, when the sun rose despite the completed cycle, relief was overwhelming. Massive celebrations erupted. Sacrifices thanked the gods for granting another 52 years. New fires were lit from sacred flame and distributed throughout the empire. Life resumed, but with knowledge that this reprieve was temporary. The next cycle might be the last. This apocalypse anxiety shaped everything. Long-term planning seemed pointless when existence itself was temporary. Suffering became more bearable knowing it was all ending anyway. Individual deaths through sacrifice seemed less extreme when framed as attempts to postpone universal death. Maybe, just maybe, enough blood would postpone the end indefinitely. Every sacrifice was simultaneously routine religious duty and desperate existential bid for collective survival. Not just feeding the gods, but begging them to maintain cosmic order for one more day. The stakes were always ultimate, making the violence feel justified and necessary rather than excessive. Prophecies and omens were interpreted constantly for evidence that the fifth sun's destruction was approaching. When the Spanish arrived, some Aztecs may have interpreted conquest through this eschatological framework. Perhaps the fifth sun was ending not through earthquake, but through foreign invasion. Perhaps these strangers with pale skin and terrifying weapons were agents of apocalypse. This interpretation may have contributed to the relatively rapid collapse of Aztec resistance. If the world is ending anyway, if prophecy is being fulfilled, military resistance seems futile. Better to accept what cosmic forces have decreed than die fighting inevitable change. The combination of inevitability, uncertainty, and responsibility created unique psychological burden. The apocalypse was definitely happening. They didn't know when. And human actions influenced timing. This made the culture simultaneously fatalistic and desperately active, resigned to doom, yet frantically performing rituals to delay it. After conquest, when Spanish victory was complete and the Aztec Empire fell, indigenous people interpreted this as confirmation that the fifth sun had ended. Prophecy fulfilled, the world had ended. Except they were still alive, conquered, traumatized, their civilization destroyed, but individually surviving. This generated profound spiritual crisis. If the world ended but didn't end, what did that mean? If the fifth sun's destruction came through conquest rather than earthquake, were the prophecies accurate or misinterpreted? If survival continued after apocalypse, what now? The Aztecs had lived every day preparing for the end. When it came, it looked different than expected. And what came after the end was stranger than anything their cosmology had prepared them to understand. Living under shadow of apocalypse shaped consciousness fundamentally. But there was one final aspect of Aztec daily life we haven't explored. One practice revealing most clearly how alien their minds were from our own. The Aztecs couldn't decide when to get married, start a business, or travel without consulting priests who calculated whether the cosmic energy of that specific day would support those actions. Personal freedom didn't mean doing what you wanted. It meant doing anything on days when the calendar permitted it. 2 interlocking calendars governed Aztec life, with complexity that required specialist priests to interpret. The Siupawali was a 365-day solar calendar, tracking agricultural and civil events. The Tonalpawali was a 260-day ritual calendar, determining sacred significance of each moment. Together, they formed a 52-year cycle so intricate that understanding it was specialized knowledge requiring years of training. Every single day had a character, not metaphorically but literally. Some days were favorable for warfare, vibrating with martial energy that ensured victory. Other days favored marriage, their cosmic properties aligning couples toward successful unions. Still other days were so inauspicious that the correct action was doing absolutely nothing, because any activity risked divine punishment or guaranteed failure. You couldn't simply decide to do something today. You had to consult calendar priests who would calculate whether the day's energy supported your intention. Want to start a business? Wrong day might guarantee economic failure, regardless of planning or skill. Want to travel? Wrong day means death on the road, from causes the calendar could predict, but you couldn't prevent. Want to plant crops? Wrong day yields famine, even if soil, weather, and technique are perfect. This created society where personal agency was subordinated to temporal mechanics beyond individual control. Imagine needing permission from cosmic forces to make every significant decision. Not practical permission from authorities you could negotiate with, but metaphysical permission from calendar patterns you could only obey. Children's entire lives were shaped by their birth dates. Not just birth order or family circumstances, but the specific day they entered the world determined everything. Names weren't chosen by parental preference, but prescribed by calendrical association. A child born on 1 crocodile received a name connecting them to that day's energy, and could expect entirely different life trajectory than a child born on 7 rain. Career paths were suggested, sometimes mandated, by birth dates. Certain days produced natural warriors, other days produced priests, artists, merchants. The day's energy became the person's essence. Personality traits weren't developed through experience, but revealed through birth date interpretation. You weren't discovering who you might become. You were learning who you already were, according to when you arrived. Individuality, as we understand it, barely existed. You were an expression of your birth date's cosmic energy rather than a unique self with unlimited potential. The concept of self-creation, of choosing your own path, would have seemed as absurd as choosing whether to be affected by gravity. Some Aztecs tried working within this system. Parents could delay registering births by a day or two if the actual birth date was inauspicious, essentially lying to give children better destinies. Some families consulted multiple calendar priests, hoping for conflicting readings they could exploit. But these workarounds existed within the system. No one questioned whether the calendar's power was real. This temporal framework made Aztec life feel scripted. History repeated in 52-year cycles, Individuals fulfilled destinies determined by birth dates. Free will was essentially non-concept. You could choose how enthusiastically to pursue your predetermined path, but the path itself wasn't negotiable. When the Spanish brought Christian linear time, it wasn't just a different calendar, it was a different ontology, a fundamentally different way of experiencing existence. Linear time moved from creation toward Judgment Day, rather than cycling endlessly. It offered the revolutionary possibility that tomorrow could be fundamentally different from today, that history was going somewhere rather than repeating. For some Aztecs, this was terrifying. Losing the predictability of cycles meant losing the security of knowing what came next. For others, it was liberating. Escaping calendrical determinism meant gaining possibility. Temporal worldview is so fundamental to consciousness that Aztecs and Spanish literally experienced time differently. Not just tracked it differently or thought about it differently, but felt it differently at the level of lived experience. Cross-cultural understanding was nearly impossible because they inhabited incompatible temporal realities. But the calendar didn't just determine when to act. It determined who you were, what you would become, and how your life would unfold from birth to death. A boy was born on the day 7 flower. This wasn't just his birthday. It was his destiny written in cosmic mechanics before he drew first breath. Within hours of birth, his parents consulted calendar priests, who calculated his tonali personal life force, shaped by the exact moment of his arrival into the world. The priests determined his lucky and unlucky day signs for the rest of his life, identified cosmic energies that would favor or oppose him, and essentially wrote his biography before he could speak or think or demonstrate any actual personality. His name wasn't chosen from affection or family tradition. It was prescribed by calendrical association, names connected to 7 flowers energy, linking him permanently to that day's characteristics. Artistic skill, creativity, appreciation for beauty, but also potential for pleasure-seeking, indiscipline, distraction from duty. The priests explained all this to his parents, who received it not as prediction, but as revelation of existing truth. His education path was predetermined. 7 flower boys were steered toward artistic crafts rather than warfare. He could overcome this with enormous effort, but the calendar's gravity pulled him toward certain futures and away from others. He learned featherwork, a prestigious craft requiring precision and aesthetic judgment that 7 flower energy supposedly enhanced. Puberty rituals were performed on calendrically calculated days. Wrong timing could compromise the entire transition from childhood to adulthood, leaving him stuck in liminal state or improperly initiated. The ceremonies had to align with both his personal birth date, energy, and current calendar position. Timing wasn't convenience, it was existential necessity. Marriage negotiations involved more than finding compatible partner. His family needed someone whose birth date energy complemented his according to complex calculations. 2 people with incompatible day signs could not marry regardless of affection, attraction, or practical suitability. The cosmic mechanics of their birth dates would create disharmony that no amount of personal effort could overcome. He became a featherwork artist, creating elaborate decorations for nobles and temples. But even within this chosen career, specific days were required for starting new projects. Wrong day meant failure regardless of skill. Meeting with clients required calendrical approval. Traveling to obtain rare feathers meant consulting priests about whether the journey's timing was cosmically supported. His life had dozens of auspicious and inauspicious days every year that controlled what he could do. Not suggestions or superstitions, but absolute parameters governing activity. He internalized this so completely that violating calendrical guidance would have felt like walking off a cliff. Obviously, inevitably catastrophic. At age 52, he completed 1 full calendar cycle. This brought rituals marking cosmic rebirth. He was, in some sense, a new person, entering a new phase that few reached. Most Aztecs didn't live long enough to complete 2 full cycles. This transition was his major calendrical milestone, experienced not as personal growth, but as cosmic realignment. In his 40s, he was selected for sacrifice. But the timing wasn't immediate. Priests calculated the exact day, months in advance, determining when his death would provide maximum cosmic benefit. He spent this period in strange liminal state, honored, fed well, prepared ritually, yet waiting for predetermined death he couldn't escape or postpone. This advanced knowledge shaped his psychology differently than sudden death would. He had time to accept, to prepare, to say farewells to family and friends. He participated in his own transformation into sacrifice, not as victim, but as willing offering whose timing was cosmically perfect. His death came on his designated day. His family's grief was tempered by calendrical understanding. He died on a day that ensured good afterlife destination. Excessive grief was inappropriate because his death was cosmically proper. The timing guaranteed his soul's successful journey to its proper realm. Even after death, calendrical mechanics governed his existence. Priests advised his family on timing for various commemorative rituals over the 4 years his soul traveled to Mictlan. Offerings had to be made on specific days to assist his journey through the underworld's obstacles. From Aztec perspective, this man hadn't lost freedom to the calendar. The calendar had provided his life with meaning, structure, and cosmic significance. He was never confused about his purpose or adrift in existential uncertainty. The calendar answered all questions before they could be asked. To modern people, this looks like imprisonment. To Aztecs, it looked like liberation from chaos. In Aztec society, there was no such thing as finding yourself. You didn't have a self to find. You had a role to fulfill, assigned by the stars at birth, and reinforced by every structure of society until death. Individual identity wasn't celebrated. It was erased. Aztec civilization, for all its architectural sophistication and artistic achievement, produced virtually no culture of individualism. No tradition of autobiography or personal diary. Surviving codices are historical, religious, or administrative. Never personal. No art celebrating individual achievement separate from collective glory. No philosophy of individual rights or personal freedom as concepts worth discussing. This wasn't oversight. This was design. The Aztec worldview held that individuals mattered only as cells in a larger cosmic organism. Personal happiness, desires, or fulfillment were not goals anyone seriously pursued. Fulfilling your calendrically determined role was the goal. Contributing to collective survival was the goal. Personal satisfaction was irrelevant to these purposes. This system suppressed certain personality types completely. The rebellious, the creative nonconformist, the philosopher who questioned foundational premises. Such individuals likely existed. Human variation guarantees it. But they had no cultural space to express themselves without being labeled threats to cosmic order. The few recorded cases of genuine dissent were framed as heresy or madness rather than disagreement. Questioning whether the calendar accurately predicted destiny wasn't viewed as intellectual curiosity. It was spiritual sickness requiring correction through ritual or elimination. There are no Aztec equivalents of Socrates, Diogenes, or other cultures' philosophical questioners. Not because Aztecs were less intelligent, they demonstrably weren't, but because their culture provided no framework where individual questioning of collective wisdom was valuable or safe. Modern psychological concepts like self-actualization, authenticity, or finding yourself would be literally incomprehensible to Aztecs. You didn't find yourself. You accepted the self assigned by birth date and social position. Questioning this assignment would be like questioning your height or eye color, meaningless resistance to obvious reality. Yet this subordination of individuality wasn't entirely oppressive in its own context. It provided meaning, belonging, and purpose that many modern people desperately seek. The existential anxiety of individual freedom. What should I do with my life? Who am I really? Didn't exist because these questions were pre-answered from birth. But the cost was real. Individual suffering that didn't fit cultural scripts had no outlet. Someone born on a warrior-favorable day who was terrified of violence had to suppress that fear or face shame and exclusion. Someone whose talents didn't match their prescribed path had to ignore those talents. Deviation from calendrical destiny was failure, not self-discovery. Which is worse? The Aztec elimination of individual freedom in service of collective meaning? Or the modern valorization of individual freedom that often leaves people isolated, anxious, and searching for meaning they never find. The question doesn't have simple answer. Both systems create suffering. Both systems provide benefits. The suffering and benefits are just distributed differently. The Spanish conquest didn't just end sacrifice. It destroyed the entire framework that made subordinating individuality acceptable. The calendar lost its power. The cosmic order that justified erasing personal identity collapsed. What emerged was traumatized hybrid culture, where neither indigenous nor Spanish values fully functioned. Aztecs had sacrificed individuality for cosmic significance. When the cosmos proved not to require that sacrifice, when the sun rose without blood and the world continued without the calendar's permissions, the exchange revealed itself as unnecessary. Individuals had been erased for nothing. Modern Mexico still grapples with this legacy. How do you build culture that honors indigenous ancestors while acknowledging they systematically eliminated aspects of human experience? Individual freedom, personal choice, self-determination that modern ethics considers fundamental, the erasure of individuality, the subordination to calendar and cosmos, the daily participation in bloodletting and sacrifice, all of this continued for centuries, sustained by genuine belief and social pressure, until suddenly it didn't. The story you've probably heard goes like this. Aztecs mistook Spanish conquistadors for gods returning from ancient prophecy, welcomed them as divine beings, and this confusion facilitated conquest. Montezuma, paralyzed by religious awe, allowed strangers to walk into his capital and destroy everything without resistance. It's a compelling narrative. It's also primarily Spanish invention, created to make brutal military aggression seem divinely ordained, rather than what it actually was, opportunistic violence by men seeking gold and glory. But there's a kernel of truth buried in the myth, and that truth is somehow more tragic than the fiction. When reports of Spanish ships reached Montezuma in 1519, he faced a genuine categorization problem. Strange men with pale skin, arriving from the east, the direction associated with Quetzalcoatl in some mythological accounts. They rode animals the Aztecs had never seen, initially described as deer because horses didn't exist in their conceptual vocabulary. They wielded weapons that made thunder without storms. They traveled in massive structures, the Aztecs called temples, because ships were equally outside their experience. Montezuma was a brilliant leader who'd expanded the empire significantly. But he was also deeply religious, consulting diviners obsessively, interpreting every omen for cosmic significance. And the Spanish arrival coincided with genuinely unsettling signs. A comet had appeared. Temple fires had broken out spontaneously. Strange birds were sighted. Priests interpreted all of this as warnings that something unprecedented was approaching. His famous hesitation, his failure to attack the Spanish immediately, wasn't cowardice. It was calculation operating within his cosmological framework. If these strangers were gods or divine emissaries, attacking them would anger cosmic forces and guarantee disaster. If they were human enemies, he could defeat them later after proper assessment. He chose diplomatic approach, the cautious option when facing unknown variables. Montezuma sent gifts, gold, elaborate costumes, sacred objects meant to honor guests and demonstrate Aztec wealth and sophistication. From his perspective, this was standard diplomatic protocol, showing respect while gathering information about who these strangers actually were. The Spanish interpreted these gifts completely differently, as submission, as evidence of vast riches waiting to be plundered, as weakness inviting exploitation. The cultural translation was catastrophically wrong on both sides. When the Spanish entered Tenochtitlan peacefully, Montezuma hosted them as diplomatic guests, according to protocols that had governed Aztec international relations for generations. Then Cortés took him hostage, turning diplomatic reception into imprisonment. This betrayal was psychologically devastating in ways that transcended the obvious. Montezuma had never conceived that guests could violate hospitality so fundamentally. Aztec warfare had rules. Diplomacy had protocols. Honor and reciprocity were assumed even between enemies. The Spanish recognized no such boundaries. They operated by completely alien ethical systems, where deception and betrayal of hospitality were acceptable tactics. The Aztec realization that these weren't gods came gradually and through disturbing evidence. Gods wouldn't get sick from altitude. Gods wouldn't rape women. Gods wouldn't melt down sacred objects for the metal, treating religious artifacts as raw materials. The Spanish were human, but humans unlike any the Aztecs had encountered before. This was worse than facing gods. Gods you could understand through existing religious frameworks. Gods operated according to cosmic principles that priests had studied for centuries. But these humans didn't fit any category Aztec civilization had developed. They were something entirely outside the system. Montezuma's death symbolized this categorical collapse. Sources conflict on whether the Spanish killed him or whether he died from projectiles thrown by his own people who'd lost faith in his leadership. But either way, his death marked the end of an entire framework of understanding reality. He'd tried to navigate the situation using 500 years of accumulated Aztec wisdom. Calendrical calculations, ritual protocols, diplomatic traditions, religious interpretations. Every tool his civilization had developed for understanding and managing the world. None of it worked, because the Spanish didn't exist in that cosmos. They were a category error that broke the system. The prophecy that Montezuma mistook Cortés for Quetzalcoatl returning? That came later, a story the Spanish told to justify what they'd done. The truth was simpler and more tragic. A sophisticated leader tried to use his civilization's entire accumulated knowledge to understand beings who didn't fit into any framework that knowledge provided. And that confusion, that fundamental inability to categorize what he was facing, killed him and destroyed everything. But Montezuma's death didn't end Aztec resistance. What followed was months of desperate warfare as Aztecs fought to preserve their world. They weren't just fighting Spanish soldiers. They were fighting something invisible that killed more efficiently than any sword. Smallpox killed more Aztecs in 6 months than Spanish soldiers killed in 6 years. And it did something worse than kill. It proved that every sacrifice, every bloodletting, every ritual performed for centuries had failed to keep the gods satisfied. The apocalypse came anyway. The Aztecs had no immunity to European diseases. Isolated from Eurasian disease pools for millennia, their immune systems had never encountered smallpox, measles, typhus, the entire catalogue of illnesses that Europeans had developed resistance to through centuries of exposure and survival. When smallpox arrived, carried by an infected Spanish soldier, it spread with terrifying speed through densely populated cities, where people lived in close quarters, shared water sources, gathered for ceremonies and markets. The biological conditions for pandemic were perfect. What smallpox meant in practice: fever that wouldn't break, skin erupting in pustules that covered entire bodies, blindness, death rates of 30% or higher in affected populations. But beyond physical suffering was theological crisis. Aztec medicine, sophisticated for its context, had no framework for understanding contagious disease. They treated illness as spiritual attack, divine punishment, or witchcraft. Individual conditions requiring individual ritual responses, but smallpox didn't work that way. It spread regardless of spiritual purity, ritual devotion, or moral standing. And nothing in their medical arsenal worked. Bloodletting didn't help. Plant medicines designed for other conditions proved useless. Prayers went unanswered. Sacrifices multiplied desperately, but the disease continued spreading. The gods, it seemed, weren't responding to proper rituals. For a civilization whose entire worldview depended on gods responding to proper rituals, this was existential collapse. The disease seemed to target Aztecs while leaving Spanish relatively unaffected. Spanish immunity meant they could walk through plague-ravaged areas without falling sick, which from Aztec perspective looked like divine protection. Were the Spanish gods more powerful? Had the Aztec gods abandoned their people? Both possibilities were theologically catastrophic. Disease amplified military defeat in ways that made conventional warfare almost irrelevant. Aztec warriors died not in honorable combat but covered in pustules, unable to stand, let alone fight. Priests who should have maintained rituals were dying. Political leaders who should have organized resistance were incapacitated. The demographic collapse was so severe that basic social functions became impossible. Crops weren't planted because farmers were dead or dying. Infrastructure wasn't maintained. Ceremonies couldn't be conducted properly when participants were dropping mid-ritual. The famous siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 wasn't primarily Spanish military superiority. It occurred while disease ravaged the city. Residents died faster than bodies could be removed. Water supplies became contaminated by decaying corpses. Survivors were too weak to fight effectively. The Spanish didn't so much conquer the city as wait for plague to do most of their work. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, led resistance, knowing the apocalypse his predecessors had feared was occurring. Not as earthquake, as prophecy suggested, but as invisible plague. He fought anyway, because what else was there to do? Surrender to the people whose arrival had brought this catastrophe? Die fighting seemed preferable to dying helpless. Scholars debate whether disease alone would have destroyed Aztec civilization, even without Spanish military conquest. The demographic catastrophe was so severe that cultural continuity became nearly impossible. Unlike military defeat, where defeated cultures can eventually recover, disease eliminated the demographic basis for civilization. The survivors weren't just conquered. They were traumatized, orphaned, outnumbered by corpses. In Aztec cosmological framework, the fifth sun had ended. Not through earthquake as predicted, but through plague. Everything their ancestors had feared and tried desperately to prevent through sacrifice had happened anyway. All those deaths, all those rituals, all that suffering, none of it had kept the gods satisfied. This created spiritual vacuum more devastating than physical destruction. If the rituals hadn't worked, if the gods had allowed or caused this apocalypse despite centuries of devotion, what had any of it meant? The entire framework that made Aztec life comprehensible collapsed. Not just the empire, but the cosmic order itself. The fifth sun had ended. The empire had collapsed. Millions had died. But Aztecs didn't vanish. When Spanish priests destroyed the Aztec temples, they thought they'd erased Aztec religion. They systematically demolished religious infrastructure, burned codices, smashed idols, executed priests who refused conversion. They believed they were eliminating indigenous spirituality and replacing it with Christianity. But they couldn't erase the knowledge embedded in bodies, daily routines, and oral traditions passed parent to child in quiet moments below Spanish notice. Some practices continued in altered forms. Bloodletting didn't entirely disappear. It transformed into Catholic penitential practices, like self-flagellation, that looked superficially similar but carried different theological meaning. Same pain, different cosmic justification. The Spanish actually approved of these practices when framed as Christian devotion rather than indigenous ritual. Calendar knowledge fragmented. Specialist priests were eliminated, their complex astronomical and mathematical expertise dying with them. But common people remembered pieces. They merged fragments of the old calendar with Catholic saint days, creating syncretic timekeeping where indigenous and European systems coexisted awkwardly. The sacred mathematics were gone, but the sense that certain days were lucky or unlucky persisted in folk tradition. Food practices showed the greatest continuity. Corn grinding techniques passed mother to daughter. Tamale recipes, chocolate preparation, herbal medicines. These survived because they were practical knowledge below Spanish notice or prohibition. Spanish authorities didn't care how indigenous women ground corn or which plants they used for minor ailments. But the ritual context evaporated. Food remained. Its sacred meanings were stripped away. Aztec social hierarchy partially mapped onto Spanish colonial caste systems. Nobles who converted to Christianity early sometimes retained status under new administration. Commoners remained commoners, their labor redirected to Spanish masters, but their essential position unchanged. But the complex calendar-based identity system vanished, replaced by Spanish categories of race and class operating by entirely different logic. The psychological experience of surviving Aztecs was profound dislocation. Living in cities built on ruins of their own demolished civilization, forced to worship in churches constructed literally from stones of their former temples, speaking hybrid languages where old concepts had no new vocabulary. How do you name things your language was designed to describe, but your new rulers forbid you to acknowledge? Marriage and family practices showed interesting persistence. Arranged marriages continued in indigenous communities, now justified as Christian family values rather than calendrical compatibility. Extended family structures remained stronger than Spanish nuclear family models, but birth date ceremonies disappeared. Wedding rituals were stripped of cosmic timing requirements. The comprehensive framework that made these practices meaningful was gone. Modern indigenous Mexican communities maintain practices recognizably descended from Aztec traditions. Day of the Dead celebrations merge Catholic All Saints' Day with older death rituals. Curanderos practice healing using pre-Columbian plant knowledge. Textile patterns encode ancient symbolism that weavers may not consciously understand but faithfully reproduce. Yet these exist as fragments, disconnected from the comprehensive cosmological system that once gave them coherent meaning. Indigenous scholars use the term survivance, not mere survival but active presence of indigenous ways, despite colonization's attempts at erasure. Not passive remnants but deliberate cultural maintenance against tremendous pressure to assimilate completely. The most enduring Aztec habits weren't the spectacular sacrifices that Spanish worked so hard to eliminate. They were mundane practices: how to prepare food, how to organize families, how to relate to the natural world, how to mark time's passage through agricultural cycles rather than mechanical clocks. These quiet continuities suggest that daily habits were more fundamental to Aztec identity than religious spectacles. The conquest ended the Aztec Empire, but didn't end Aztec people. Their descendants live today in Mexico and throughout the Americas, carrying genetic, cultural, and psychological inheritances from ancestors who woke each morning and drew blood before the sun rose. Some know their ancestry explicitly. Others carry it unconsciously through practices they've never questioned, because that's just how their families have always done things. The ghost life of practices, fragments of knowledge, inherited habits disconnected from original meanings. This is what remains. Which raises a final, uncomfortable question. What do modern people, particularly descendants of Aztecs, do with this history? How do you build identity from a legacy that includes both sophisticated civilization and practices modern ethics consider horrifying? Modern indigenous Mexicans inherit contradictory legacy. Ancestors who built magnificent cities and created sophisticated knowledge systems, who also ripped hearts from chests and built walls of skulls. How do you love your heritage when part of that heritage horrifies you? Approximately 25 million Mexicans today identify as indigenous, many with genetic and cultural links to Aztec civilization. They navigate psychological complexity that has no simple resolution. On one hand, Aztec civilization represents indigenous achievement, sophistication, resistance to colonization, source of pride and identity in face of ongoing marginalization. On the other hand, human sacrifice and extreme practices create discomfort, especially when others use them to justify historical conquest or contemporary racism. Mexican national identity itself demonstrates this contradiction. The Aztec calendar stone appears on the Mexican flag and currency. Aztec symbols are nationalist iconography. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor who resisted the Spanish, is national hero. Yet actual indigenous people remain economically and socially marginalized. Mexico simultaneously celebrates and distances itself from indigenous heritage, claiming the glory while avoiding the people. In indigenous villages throughout Morelos, Oaxaca, and other regions, people maintain Nahuatl language, traditional agriculture, some pre-Columbian practices. These communities navigate between cultural continuity and selective rejection, resisting complete erasure while also acknowledging that not everything ancestors did should be preserved. Human sacrifice is universally condemned. No indigenous community argues for its revival. But calendar knowledge, herbal medicine, ritual approaches to nature, these are maintained, adapted, integrated into contemporary life. The line between what to preserve and what to reject isn't always clear or agreed upon. Anthropologists and archaeologists uncover Aztec history, providing knowledge that indigenous communities sometimes welcome, sometimes resent. Their work risks turning living heritage into museum artifacts studied by outsiders. Some indigenous activists argue scholars should consult with communities before publishing findings about their ancestors. Who owns this history? Who has the right to interpret it? Contemporary politics amplify these tensions. Indigenous rights movements invoke Aztec heritage to claim legitimacy and land rights. The Mexican government's relationship with indigenous communities remains fraught, caught between celebrating indigenous past and marginalizing indigenous present. Internal debates within indigenous communities reveal no consensus. Some argue for complete rejection of anything associated with human sacrifice, fearing it feeds racist stereotypes that indigenous people are savage or backward. Others argue that understanding ancestors' worldview, even disturbing aspects, is necessary for complete cultural knowledge, that sanitizing history to make it palatable erases complexity and truth. Trauma can be inherited across generations. Descendants of colonization experience psychological effects even without direct personal experience of conquest. Modern indigenous Mexicans often describe feeling disconnected from aspects of their own history, as though important knowledge was deliberately destroyed, which it was leaving them with fragments they can't fully assemble. This creates strange relationship with the past. Knowing your ancestors did remarkable things, while also knowing they did horrifying things. Feeling simultaneously proud and ashamed. Wanting to honor heritage, while acknowledging that some aspects of that heritage violate your contemporary values. The question has no simple answer. How do you integrate this legacy? Some indigenous people focus exclusively on positive aspects: mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, art. Others engage directly with difficult history, arguing that honoring ancestors means understanding them fully, not selectively. Still others reject identification with the Aztec past entirely, focusing on building contemporary indigenous identity not tied to empire or sacrifice. This inheritance of trauma isn't unique to Mexico. Colonized peoples globally grapple with loving ancestors who practice things modern ethics condemn. How do you honor heritage while acknowledging its darkest aspects? How do you build identity from fragmented, contradictory historical legacy? How do you resist ongoing marginalization by claiming connection to powerful ancestral civilization while also distancing yourself from that civilization's most disturbing practices? These questions persist 500 years after conquest. They don't have simple answers. Perhaps they're not meant to. Perhaps the work of inheritance is learning to hold complexity without resolving it into comfortable simplicity. But the legacy extends beyond indigenous communities. Everyone who learns about Aztec civilization must grapple with what this history means. Can you judge the Aztecs for human sacrifice while living in a society that might itself be judged harshly by people 500 years from now? The question isn't just about them. It's about the relativity of all moral certainty, including your own. The academic debate has clear positions. Cultural relativists argue that judging past cultures by present values is ethically problematic and historically inaccurate. We must understand practices within their own contexts. Universalists argue that some practices violate fundamental human rights that transcend cultural context. Deliberately killing people is wrong regardless of belief system. How we answer this question isn't just academic. It shapes contemporary issues from indigenous rights to how we evaluate all historical civilizations. It determines whether we see the past as foreign country with alien values or as subject to same moral standards we claim for ourselves. Different frameworks offer different understandings. The contextualist approach holds that Aztecs genuinely believed sacrifice prevented cosmic catastrophe. Their actions were internally logical, even if externally horrifying. Judging them as evil imposes modern categories onto past that didn't think that way. The universalist approach maintains that context explains but doesn't justify. Deliberately killing people violates fundamental rights. Understanding why they did it doesn't make it acceptable. The structural approach focuses on power dynamics. Aztec sacrifice served political control functions. Priests and nobility benefited from a system that kept commoners compliant. Understanding those power structures matters more than religious beliefs. Most historians reject simple judgment because it's historically unhelpful. The interesting question isn't whether we approve. It's what circumstances created this system and maintained it for centuries. How did sophisticated civilization normalize mass killing? What psychological and social mechanisms made it functional? The Aztecs themselves weren't monolithic. Evidence suggests internal debates, questioning, variation in how seriously individuals took religious obligations. Some participated enthusiastically, others grudgingly, some probably covertly resisted. Treating all Aztecs as uniform believers erases human complexity. What makes Aztec practices particularly challenging for modern judgment is that they weren't random cruelty. They were systematic, sophisticated, embedded in advanced civilization. The Aztecs had mathematics, astronomy, literature, philosophy. We can't simply categorize them as primitive barbarians. This forces uncomfortable recognition that civilization and atrocity aren't opposites. And here's where the mirror gets uncomfortable. Modern societies also normalize practices future generations may condemn. Factory farming kills billions of animals annually in conditions of systematic suffering. Environmental destruction knowingly causes species extinction and potential climate catastrophe. Income inequality creates suffering we could prevent but choose not to. Mass incarceration, exploitative labor, resource extraction, the list continues. The gap between how we see ourselves humane, ethical, advanced, and how future people may see us might be as large as the gap between how we see Aztecs and how they saw themselves. We believe our normalized practices are necessary, or at least acceptable. Future generations might be horrified. Every person must decide how they relate to this history. Do you find it fascinating or repulsive? Both? Does learning about it change your understanding of human nature? Does it make you more or less judgmental of other cultures' practices? There's no correct answer. The documentary has presented information and trusts you to think. Perhaps the point isn't reaching final judgment, but maintaining tension. Holding simultaneously that Aztec practices were products of specific worldview that made sense internally. That those practices caused immense suffering we can acknowledge without endorsing. And that all cultures, including our own, contain normalized practices that might horrify outsiders or future generations. Intellectual maturity means tolerating complexity without resolving it into simple verdict. The Aztecs weren't monsters. They weren't enlightened. They were humans operating within cultural frameworks that made certain terrible things seem necessary, just like us. These questions about judgment, relativity, and human nature don't have final answers, but they have implications for how we understand ourselves, our own cultures, and the daily habits we practice without questioning. We judge Aztecs for human sacrifice. Future generations might judge us for factory farming, climate change, and inequality. The terrifying truth isn't that they were monsters and we're enlightened. It's that we're all humans, navigating ethical frameworks our cultures provide, unable to fully see our own blind spots until it's too late. Imagine an Aztec time traveled to modern day and observed our habits. What would terrify them? Factory farming would seem eerily parallel to their own sacrifice system. We systematically kill billions of animals annually in conditions of suffering, not for cosmic necessity but for taste, preference, and convenience. From their perspective, at least they killed for existential reasons to keep the sun rising. We kill for hamburgers. Environmental destruction might seem like our failure to perform rituals maintaining cosmic order. We know we're causing species extinction and climate catastrophe. We have the knowledge and means to stop. Yet we continue anyway, destroying the world not through active worship but through passive neglect. The Aztecs would recognize this pattern, knowing disaster is coming but being unable to change the systems causing it. We normalize practices through the same enculturation mechanisms the Aztecs used. Children learn that vast inequality is normal, that some people deserve wealth, while others deserve poverty. That the way things are is the way things must be. By adulthood, these beliefs are so embedded that questioning them feels absurd. Our obsessive checking of social media mirrors Aztec calendar checking. Both are forms of constant vigilance about invisible forces that might affect our lives. They consulted priests about cosmic alignments. We consult algorithms about social validation. Different specifics, same psychological pattern. Our willingness to sacrifice personal health and time to jobs mirrors their willingness to sacrifice bodies to gods. Both are forms of subordinating individual well-being to larger systems we believe necessary. We destroy ourselves slowly through stress and overwork. They destroyed themselves quickly through ritual violence. Different methods, similar subordination. Our anxiety about climate change echoes their apocalypse anxiety. Both involve knowing catastrophe is coming, but continuing daily routines anyway. We're living in the end times, while checking our phones and buying groceries, and pretending normalcy is sustainable. The point isn't that modern life equals Aztec sacrifice. The point is that humans in all eras participate in systems creating suffering, while believing those systems are necessary or inevitable. Cultural frameworks make certain forms of violence invisible or acceptable, while making others seem obviously wrong. Daily habits that would terrify you. That phrase describes not just Aztecs but any culture examined from outside perspective, including our own. The difference isn't that we're more ethical. It's that we're inside our cultural framework, making our normalities invisible just as theirs were invisible to them. This recognition could be used multiple ways: to become more critically aware of modern practices and their costs, to develop humility about our own moral certainty, recognizing future generations might judge us as harshly as we judge past cultures, or to embrace radical ethical relativism, where nothing is really wrong because every culture has problems. The first two approaches are more productive than the third. Studying Aztec daily habits isn't just about learning weird history. It's about understanding how culture shapes consciousness, how systems normalize atrocity, how beliefs make suffering bearable, and how difficult it is to see your own era clearly. The Aztecs weren't aliens from another planet. They were humans like us, trying to make sense of uncertain existence through systems that provided meaning, even when those systems required terrible costs. 500 years from now, people might study us the same way, with mixture of fascination, horror, and wondering how we didn't see what we were doing. The most terrifying thing about Aztec daily habits isn't how different they were from ours. It's how similar the psychological mechanisms were, how similar they remain today. We're all just trying to survive in cosmic frameworks we inherited, performing rituals we hope give meaning to suffering we can't prevent, finding purpose in systems that demand sacrifice we've learned not to question. The Aztecs drew blood every morning to make the sun rise. What do you do every morning that future generations might not understand? What habits feel so normal to you that you can't imagine them being questioned? What are you participating in right now that you can't see because you're standing too close to it? The sun rises without blood now. We know that. But we still perform our own rituals, make our own sacrifices, participate in our own systems of normalized violence, just different ones, shaped by different stories about what's necessary for the world to continue. And 500 years from now, if anyone remembers us at all, they'll ask the same questions we asked about the Aztecs. How did they not see it? How did they live that way?